Arriving for dinner at the village and leaving his horse at the cottage of an old friend of his, the husband of his brother's wet nurse, Levin went to see the old man in his beehive, wanting to find out from him the truth about the hay parmianch. A talkative, comely old man gave Levin a very warm welcome, showed him all he was doing, told him everything about his bees and the swarms of that year, but gave vague and unwilling answers to Levin's inquiries about the mowing. This confirmed Levin still more in his suspicions. He went to the hay fields and examined the stacks. The hay stacks could not possibly contain 50 wagon loads each, and to convict the peasants, Levin ordered the wagons that had carried the hay to be brought up directly to lift one stack and carry it into the barn. There turned out to be only 32 loads in the stack, in spite of the village elders' assertions about the compressibility of hay and its having settled down in the stacks, and his swearing that everything had been done in the fear of God. Levin stuck to his point that the hay had been divided without his orders, and that therefore he would not accept that hay as 50 loads to a stack. After a prolonged dispute, the matter was decided by the peasants, taking these 11 stacks, reckoning them as 50 loads each. The arguments and the division of the haycocks lasted the whole afternoon. When the last of the hay had been divided, Levin, trusting the superintendence of the rest to the counting house clerk, sat down on a haycock marked off by the stake of willow and looked admiringly at the meadow swarming with peasants. In front of him, in the bend of the river beyond the marsh, moved a bright-colored line of peasant women, and the scattered hay was being rapidly formed into gray winding rows over the pale green stubble. After the women came the men with pitchforks, and from the gray rows there were growing up broad, high, soft haycocks. To the left, carts were rumbling over the meadow that had been already cleared, and one after another the haycocks vanished, flung up in huge forkfuls, and in their place there were rising heavy cart loads of fragrant hay hanging over the horses' hind quarters. What weather for haying, what hay it'll be said. The old man squatting down beside Levin. It's tea, not hay. It's like scattering grain to the ducks, the way they pick it up, he added, pointing to the growing haycocks, since dinner time. They've carried a good half of it, the last load, he shouted to a young peasant who drove by, standing in the front of an empty cart, shaking the cord reins. The last dab, the lad shouted back, pulling in the horse, and smiling he looked round at a bright rosy-cheeked peasant girl who sat in the cart, smiling too, and drove on. Who's that, your son? asked Levin. My baby, said the old man with a tender smile. What a fine fellow. The lad's all right, married already? Yes, it's 2 years last St. Philip's Day. Any children? Children indeed. Why, for over a year. He was innocent as a babe himself, and bashful to answer the old man. Well, the hay, it's as fragrant as tea, he repeated, wishing to change the subject. Levin looked more attentively at Ivan Parmenov and his wife. They were loading a haycock onto the cart not far from him. Ivan Parmenov was standing on the cart, laying in place and stamping down the huge bundles of hay which his pretty young wife deftly handed up to him, at first in armfuls, and then on the pitchfork. The young wife worked easily, merrily, and dexterously. The close-packed hay did not once break away off her fork. First she gathered it together, stuck the fork into it, then with a rapid, supple movement leaned the whole weight of her body on it, and at once with a bend of her back under the red belt she drew herself up, and arching her full bosom under the white smock, with a smart turn swung the fork in her arms, and flung the bundle of hay high onto the cart. Ivan, obviously doing his best to save her every minute of unnecessary labor, made haste, opening his arms to clutch the bundle and lay it in the cart. As she raked together what was left of the hay, the young wife shook off the bits of hay that had fallen on her neck, and straightening the red kerchief that had dropped forward over her white brow, not browned like her face by the sun, she crept under the cart to tie up the load. Ivan directed her how to fasten the cord to the crosspiece, and at something she said he laughed aloud, and the expressions of both faces was to be seen. Vigorous young, freshly awakened love. Chapter 12. The load was tied on. Ivan jumped down and took the quiet, sleek horse by the bridle. The young wife flung the rake up on the load, and with a bold step, swinging her arms, she went to join the women who were forming a ring for the haymakers' dance. Ivan drove off to the road and fell into line with the other loaded carts. The peasant women, with their rakes on their shoulders, gay with bright flowers and chattering with ringing merry voices, walked behind the hay cart. One wild, untrained female voice broke into a song and sang it alone through a verse, and then the same verse was taken up and repeated by 100 strong, healthy voices of all sorts, coarse and fine, singing in unison. The women, all singing, began to come close to Levin, and he felt as though a storm were swooping down upon him with a thunder of merriment. The storm swooped down, enveloped him in the haycock on which he was lying, and the other haycocks, and the wagon loads, and the whole meadow, and distant fields all seemed to be shaking and singing to the measures of this wild, merry song, with its shouts and whistles and clapping. Levin felt envious of this health and mirthfulness. He longed to take part in the expression of this joy of life, but he could do nothing and had to lie and look on and listen when the peasants, with their singing, had vanished out of sight, and hearing a weary feeling of despondency at his own isolation, his physical inactivity, his alienation from the world, came over Levin. Some of the very peasants who had been most active in wrangling with him over the hay, some whom he had treated with contumely and who had tried to cheat him, those very peasants had greeted him good-humoredly and evidently had not were incapable of having any feeling of rancor against him, any regret, any recollection, even of having tried to deceive him. All that was drowned in a sea of merry, common labor. God gave the day, God gave the strength, and the day and the strength were consecrated to labor, and that labor was its own reward. For whom the labor, what would be its fruits? These were idle considerations beside the point. Often Levin had admired this life, often he had a sense of envy of the men who led this life, but today, for the first time, especially under the influence of what he had seen in the attitude of Ivan Parmenov to his young wife, the idea presented itself definitely to his mind that it was in his power to exchange the dreary artificial idle and individualistic life he was leading for this laborious, pure, and socially delightful life. The old man who'd been sitting beside him had long ago gone home. The people had all separated. Those who lived near had gone home, while those who came from far were gathered into a group for supper and to spend the night in the meadow. Levin, unobserved by the peasants, lay still on the haycock and still looked on and listened and mused. The peasants, who remained for the night in the meadow, scarcely slept all the short summer night. At first there was the sound of merry talk and laughing all together over the supper, then singing again and laughter. All the long day of toil had left no trace in them but lightness of heart. Before the early dawn all was hushed. Nothing was to be heard but the night sounds of the frogs that never ceased in the marsh, and the horses snorting in the mist that rose over the meadow. Before the morning, rousing himself, Levin got up from the haycock, and looking at the stars he saw that the night was over. Well, what am I going to do? How am I to set about it? He said to himself, trying to express to himself all the thoughts and feelings he had passed through in that brief night. All the thoughts and feelings he had passed through fell into three separate trains of thought. One was the renunciation of his old life, of his utterly useless education. This renunciation gave him satisfaction and was easy and simple. Another series of thoughts and mental images related to the life he longed to live now, the simplicity, the purity, the sanity of this life he felt clearly, and he was convinced he would find in it the content, the peace, and the dignity of the lack of which he was so miserably conscious. But a third series of ideas turned upon the question how to effect this transition from the old life to the new, and there nothing took clear shape for him. Have a wife, have work, and the necessity of work. Leave Pokrovskogo by land, become a member of a peasant community, marry a peasant girl. How am I to set about it? He asked himself again and could not find an answer. I haven't slept all night though, and I can't think it out clearly. He said to himself, I'll work it out later. One thing's certain, this night has decided my fate. All my old dreams of home life were absurd, not the real thing, he told himself. It's all ever so much simpler and better. How beautiful, he thought, looking at the strange, as it were mother of pearl shell of white fleecy cloudlets resting right over his head in the middle of the sky. How exquisite it all is in this exquisite night. And when was there time for that cloud shell to form just now? I looked at the sky, and there was nothing in it, only two white streaks, yes, And so, imperceptibly, to my views of life changed, he went out of the meadow and walked along the high road towards the village. A slight wind arose, and the sky looked gray and sullen. The gloomy moment had come that usually precedes the dawn, the full triumph of light over darkness. Shrinking from the cold, Levin walked rapidly, looking at the ground. What's that? Someone coming, he thought, catching the tinkle of bells, and lifting his head 40 paces from him, a carriage with 4 horses harnessed abreast was driving towards him along the grassy road on which he walked. The shaft horses were tilted against the shafts by the ruts, but the dexterous driver sitting on the box held the shaft over the ruts so that the wheels ran on the smooth part of the road. This was all Levin noticed, and without wondering who it could be, he gazed absently at the coach. In the coach was an old lady dozing in one corner, and at the window, evidently only just awake, sat a young girl holding in both hands the ribbons of a white cap, with a face full of light and thought, full of a subtle, complex inner life that was remote from Levin. She was gazing beyond him at the glow of the sunrise. At the very instant when this apparition was vanishing, the truthful eyes glanced on him. She recognized him, and her face lighted up with wondering delight. He could not be mistaken. There were no other eyes like those in the world. There was only one creature in the world that could concentrate for him all the brightness and meaning of life. It was she. It was Kitty. He understood that she was driving to Ergachev from the railway station, and everything that had been stirring Levin during that sleepless night, all the resolutions he had made, all vanished at once. He recalled with horror his dreams of marrying a peasant girl there only in the carriage that had crossed over to the other side of the road and was rapidly disappearing there. Only could he find the solution of the riddle of his life, which had weighed so agonizingly upon him of late. She did not look out again. The sound of the carriage springs was no longer audible. The bells could scarcely be heard. The barking of dogs showed the carriage had reached the village, and all that was left was the empty fields all around the village in front, and he himself isolated and apart from it all. Wandering lonely along the deserted high road, he glanced at the sky, expecting to find there the cloud shell he had been admiring and taking as the symbol of the ideas and feelings of that night. There was nothing in the sky in the least like a shell there. In the remote heights above, a mysterious change had been accomplished. There was no trace of shell, and there was stretched over fully half the sky an even cover of tiny and ever tinier cloudlets. The sky had grown blue and bright, and with the same softness, but with the same remoteness, it met his questioning gaze. No, he said to himself, however good that life of simplicity and toil may be, I cannot go back to it. I love her. Chapter 13. None but those who were most intimate with Alexei Alexandrovich knew that while on the surface the coldest and most reasonable of men, he had one weakness quite opposed to the general trend of his character. Alexei Alexandrovich could not hear or see a child or woman crying without being moved. The sight of tears threw him into a state of nervous agitation, and he utterly lost all power of reflection. The chief secretary of his department and his private secretary were aware of this, and used to warn women who came with petitions on no account to give way to tears if they did not want to ruin their chances. He will get angry and will not listen to you, they used to say, and as a fact in such cases the emotional disturbance set up in Alexei Alexandrovich by the sight of tears found expression in hasty anger. I can do nothing, kindly leave the room, he would commonly cry in such cases. When returning from the races, Anna had informed him of her relations with Vronsky, and immediately afterwards had burst into tears, hiding her face in her hands. Alexei Alexandrovich, for all the fury aroused in him against her, was aware at the same time of a rush of that emotional disturbance always produced in him by tears. Conscious of it, and conscious that any expression of his feelings at that minute would be out of keeping with the position, he tried to suppress every manifestation of life in himself, and so neither stirred nor looked at her. This was what had caused that strange expression of death-like rigidity in his face, which had so impressed Anna. When they reached the house, he helped her get out of the carriage, and making an effort to master himself, took leave of her with his usual urbanity, and uttered that phrase that bound him to nothing. He said that tomorrow he would let her know his decision. His wife's words, confirming his worst suspicions, had sent a cruel pang to the heart of Alexei Alexandrovich. That pang was intensified by the strange feeling of physical pity for her set up by her tears. But when he was all alone in the carriage, Alexei Alexandrovich, to his surprise and delight, felt complete relief both from this pity and from the doubts and agonies of jealousy. He experienced the sensations of a man who has had a tooth out after suffering long from toothache after a fearful agony, and a sense of something huge bigger than the head itself being torn out of his jaw. The sufferer, hardly able to believe in his own good luck, feels all at once that what has so long poisoned his existence and chained his attention exists no longer, and that he can live and think again and take interest in other things besides his tooth. This feeling Alexei Alexandrovich was experiencing, the agony, had been strange and terrible. But now it was over. He felt that he could live again and think of something other than his wife. No honor, no heart, no religion, a corrupt woman. I always knew it and always saw it, though I tried to deceive myself to spare her, he said to himself, and it actually seemed to him that he always had seen it. He recalled incidents of their past life in which he'd never seen anything wrong before. Now these incidents proved clearly that she had always been a corrupt woman. I made a mistake in linking my life to hers, but there was nothing wrong in my mistake, and so I cannot be unhappy. It's not I that am to blame, he told himself, but I have nothing to do with her. She does not exist for me. Everything relating to her and her son, towards whom his sentiments were as much changed as towards her, ceased to interest him. The only thing that interested him now was the question of in what way he could best, with most propriety and comfort for himself, and thus with most justice, extricate himself from the mud with which she had spattered him in her fall, and then proceed along his path of active, honorable, and useful existence. I cannot be made unhappy by the fact that a contemptible woman has committed a crime. I have only to find the best way out of the difficult position in which she has placed me, and I shall find it, he said to himself, frowning more and more. I'm not the first nor the last, and to say nothing of historical instances dating from the fair Helen of Menelaus, recently revived in the memory of all, a whole list of contemporary examples of husbands with unfaithful wives in the highest society rose before Alexei Alexandrovich's imagination. Daria of Poltavsky, Prince Karibnov, Count Pashkudin, Dram. Yes, even Dram, such an honest, capable fellow. Semenov, Shagin, Siganin. Alexei Alexandrovich remembered, admitting that a certain quite irrational ridicule falls to the lot of these men, yet I never saw anything but a misfortune in it, and always felt sympathy for it. Alexei Alexandrovich said to himself, though indeed this was not the fact, and he had never felt sympathy for misfortunes of that kind, but the more frequently he had heard of instances of unfaithful wives betraying their husbands, the more highly he had thought of himself. It's a misfortune that may befall anyone, and this misfortune has befallen me. The only thing to be done is to make the best of the position. And he began passing in review the methods of proceeding of men who had been in the same position that he was in. Daryalov fought a duel. The duel had particularly fascinated the thoughts of Alexei Alexandrovich in his youth, just because he was physically a coward and was himself well aware of the fact. Alexei Alexandrovich could not without horror contemplate the idea of a pistol aimed at himself, and had never made use of any weapon in his life. This horror had in his youth set him pondering on dueling and picturing himself in a position in which he would have to expose his life to danger, having attained success and an established position in the world. He had long ago forgotten this feeling, but the habitual bent of feeling reasserted itself, and dread of his own cowardice proved even now so strong that Alexei Alexandrovich spent a long while thinking over the question of dueling in all its aspects, and hugging the idea of a duel, though he was fully aware beforehand that he would never under any circumstances fight one. There's no doubt our society is still so barbarous. It's not the same in England that very many, and among these were those whose opinion Alexei Alexandrovich particularly valued, look favorably on the duel. But what result is attained by it? Suppose the first call him out, Alexei Alexandrovich went on to himself, and vividly picturing the night he would spend after the challenge, and the pistol aimed at him, he shuddered and knew that he would never do it. Suppose I call him out, suppose I am taught. He went on musing. To shoot, to press the trigger, he said to himself, closing his eyes, and it turns out I've killed him, Alexei Alexandrovich said to himself, and he shook his head as though to dispel such silly ideas. What sense is there in murdering a man in order to define one's relation to a guilty wife and son? I should still just as much have to decide what I ought to do with her. But what is more probable, and what would doubtless occur? I should be killed or wounded. I, the innocent person, should be the victim, killed or wounded. It's even more senseless, but apart from that, a challenge to fight would be an act hardly honest on my side. Don't I know perfectly well that my friends would never allow me to fight a duel, would never allow the life of a statesman needed by Russia to be exposed to danger, knowing perfectly well beforehand that the matter would never come to real danger. It would amount to my simply trying to gain a certain sham reputation by such a challenge that would be dishonest, that would be false, that would be deceiving myself and others. A duel is quite irrational, and no one expects it of me. My aim is simply to safeguard my reputation, which is essential for the uninterrupted pursuit of my public duties, official duties, which had always been of great consequence. In Alexei Alexandrovich's eyes seemed of special importance to his mind at this moment. Considering and rejecting the duel, Alexei Alexandrovich turned to divorce, another solution selected by several of the husbands he remembered passing in mental review all the instances he knew of divorces. There were plenty of them in the very highest society with which he was very familiar. Alexei Alexandrovich could not find a single example in which the object of divorce was that which he had in view. In all these instances, the husband had practically ceded or sold his unfaithful wife, and the very party which, being in fault, had not the right to contract a fresh marriage, had formed counterfeit pseudo-matrimonial ties with a self-styled husband. In his own case, Alexei Alexandrovich saw that a legal divorce, that is to say one in which only the guilty wife would be repudiated, was impossible of attainment. He saw that the complex conditions of the life they led made the coarse proofs of his wife's guilt required by the law out of the question. He saw that a certain refinement in that life would not admit of such proofs being brought forward even if he had them, and that to bring forward such proofs would damage him in the public estimation more than it would her. An attempted divorce could lead to nothing but a public scandal, which would be a perfect godsend to his enemies for calumny and attacks on his high position in society. His chief object, to define the position with the least amount of disturbance possible, would not be attained by divorce either. Moreover, in the event of divorce, or even of an attempt to obtain a divorce, it was obvious that the wife broke off all relations with the husband and threw in her lot with the lover, and in spite of the complete, as he supposed, contempt and indifference he now felt for his wife, at the bottom of his heart Alexei Alexandrovich still had one feeling left in regard to her: a disinclination to see her free to throw in her lot with Vronsky, so that her crime would be to her advantage. The mere notion of this so exasperated Alexei Alexandrovich that directly it rose to his mind he groaned with inward agony and got up and changed his place in the carriage, and for a long while after he sat with scowling brows, wrapping his numbed and bony legs in the fleecy rug. Apart from formal divorce, one might still do like Karabnov Pashkudin and that good fellow Dram, that is separate from one's wife. He went on thinking when he had regained his composure. But this step presented the same drawback of public scandal as a divorce, and what was more, a separation quite as much as a regular divorce. Flung his wife into the arms of Vronsky. No, it's out of the question, out of the question, he said again, twisting his rug about him. I cannot be unhappy, but neither she nor he ought to be happy. The feeling of jealousy which had tormented him during the period of uncertainty had passed away at the instant when the tooth had been with agony extracted by his wife's words. But that feeling had been replaced by another, the desire not merely that she should not be triumphant, but that she should get due punishment for her crime. He did not acknowledge this feeling, but at the bottom of his heart he longed for her to suffer for having destroyed his peace of mind, his honor, and going once again over the conditions inseparable from a duel, a divorce, a separation, and once again rejecting them. Alexei Alexandrovich felt convinced that there was only one solution: to keep her with him, concealing what had happened from the world, and using every measure in his power to break off the intrigue. And still more, though this he did not admit to himself, to punish her. I must inform her of my conclusion, that thinking over the terrible position in which She has placed her family. All other solutions will be worse for both sides than an external status quo, and that such I agree to retain on the strict condition of obedience on her part to my wishes, that is to say, cessation of all intercourse with her lover. When this decision had been finally adopted, another weighty consideration occurred to Alexei Alexandrovich in support of it. By such a course only shall I be acting in accordance with the dictates of religion, he told himself. In adopting this course, I'm not casting off a guilty wife, but giving her a chance of amendment. And indeed, difficult as the task will be to me, I shall devote part of my energies to her reformation and salvation. Though Alexei Alexandrovich was perfectly aware that he could not exert any moral influence over his wife, that such an attempt at reformation could lead to nothing but falsity, though in passing through these difficult moments he had not once thought of seeking guidance in religion, yet now, when his conclusion corresponded, as it seemed to him, with the requirements of religion, this religious sanction to his decision gave him complete satisfaction, and to some extent restored his peace of mind. He was pleased to think that even in such an important crisis in life, no one would be able to say that he had not acted in accordance with the principles of that religion, whose banner he had always held aloft amid the general coolness and indifference. As he pondered over subsequent developments, Alexei Alexandrovich did not see indeed why his relations with his wife should not remain practically the same as before. No doubt she could never regain his esteem, but there was not and there could not be any sort of reason that his existence should be troubled and that he should suffer because she was a bad and faithless wife. Yes, time will pass, time which arranges all things, and the old relations will be re-established. Alexei Alexandrovich told himself, so far re-established, that is, that I shall not be sensible of a break in the continuity of my life. She is bound to be unhappy, but I am not to blame, and so I cannot be unhappy. Chapter 14. As he neared Petersburg, Alexei Alexandrovich not only adhered entirely to his decision, but was even composing in his head the letter he would write to his wife. Going into the porter's room, Alexei Alexandrovich glanced at the letters and papers brought from his office and directed that they should be brought to him in his study. The horses can be taken out, and I will see no one, he said in answer to the porter, with a certain pleasure indicative of his agreeable frame of mind, emphasizing the words "see no one" in his study. Alexei Alexandrovich walked up and down twice and stopped at an immense writing table on which 6 candles had already been lighted by the valet who had preceded him. He cracked his knuckles and sat down, sorting out his writing appurtenances. Putting his elbows on the table, he bent his head on one side, thought a minute, and began to write. Without pausing for a second, he wrote without using any form of address to her, and wrote in French, making use of the plural "vous," which is not the same note of coldness as the corresponding Russian form. At our last conversation, I notified you of my intention to communicate to you my decision in regard to the subject of that conversation. Having carefully considered everything, I am writing now with the object of fulfilling that promise. My decision is as follows: whatever your conduct may have been, I do not consider myself justified in breaking the ties in which we are bound by a higher power. The family cannot be broken up by a whim, a caprice, or even by the sin of one of the partners in the marriage, and our life must go on as it has done in the past. This is essential for me, for you, and for our son. I am fully persuaded that you have repented and do repent of what is called forth the present letter, and that you will cooperate with me in eradicating the cause of our estrangement and forgetting the past. In the contrary event, you can conjecture what awaits you and your son. All this I hope to discuss more in detail in a personal interview. As the season is drawing to a close, I would beg you to return to Petersburg as quickly as possible, not later than Tuesday. All necessary preparations shall be made for your arrival here. I beg you to note that I attach particular significance to compliance with this request. To Karenin. P.S. I enclose the money which may be needed for your expenses. He read the letter through and felt pleased with it, and especially that he had remembered to enclose money. There was not a harsh word, not a reproach in it, nor was there undue indulgence. Most of all, it was a golden bridge for return. Folding the letter and smoothing it with a massive ivory knife and putting it in an envelope with the money, he rang the bell with the gratification It always afforded him to use the well-arranged appointments of his writing table. Give this to the courier to be delivered to Anna Arkadyevna tomorrow at the summer villa, he said, getting up. Certainly, Your Excellency. Tea to be served in the study. Alexei Alexandrovich ordered tea to be brought to the study, and playing with the massive paper knife, he moved to his easy chair, near which there had been placed ready for him a lamp and the French work on Egyptian hieroglyphics that he had begun. Over the easy chair there hung in a gold frame an oval portrait of Anna, a fine painting by a celebrated artist. Alexei Alexandrovich glanced at it. The unfathomable eyes gazed ironically and insolently at him. Insufferably insolent and challenging was the effect in Alexei Alexandrovich's eyes of the black lace about the head, admirably touched in by the painter, the black hair and handsome white hand with one finger lifted covered with rings. After looking at the portrait for a minute, Alexei Alexandrovich shuddered so that his lips quivered, and he uttered the sound and turned away. He made haste to sit down in his easy chair and open the book he tried to read, but he could not revive the very vivid interest he had felt before in Egyptian hieroglyphics. He looked at the book and thought of something else. He thought not of his wife, but of a complication that had arisen in his official life, which at the time constituted the chief interest of it. He felt that he had penetrated more deeply than ever before into this intricate affair, and that he had originated a leading idea, he could say it without self-flattery, calculated to clear up the whole business, to strengthen him in his official career, to discomfit his enemies, and thereby to be the greatest benefit to the government directly. The servant had set the tea and left the room. Alexei Alexandrovich got up and went to the writing table, moving into the middle of the table a portfolio of papers. With a scarcely perceptible smile of self-satisfaction, he took a pencil from a rack and plunged into the perusal of a complex report relating to the present complication. The complication was of this nature: Alexei Alexandrovich's characteristic quality as a politician, that special individual qualification that every rising functionary possesses, the qualification that with his unflagging ambition, his reserve, his honesty, and with his self-confidence had made his career, was his contempt for red tape, his cutting down of correspondence, his direct contact, whenever possible, with the living fact, and his economy. It happened that the famous commission of June 2nd had set on foot an inquiry into the irrigation of lands in the Tsarist province, which fell under Alexei Alexandrovich's department, and was a glaring example of fruitless expenditure and paper reforms. Alexei Alexandrovich was aware of the truth of this. The irrigation of these lands in the Tsarist province had been initiated by the predecessor of Alexei Alexandrovich's predecessor, and vast sums of money had actually been spent and were still being spent on this business, and utterly unproductively, and the whole business could obviously lead to nothing whatever. Alexei Alexandrovich had perceived this at once on entering office, and would have liked to lay hands on the Board of Irrigation. But at first, when he did not yet feel secure in his position, he knew it would affect too many interests and would be injudicious later on. He had been engrossed in other questions and had simply forgotten the Board of Irrigation. It went of itself, like all such boards, by the mere force of inertia. Many people gained their livelihood by the Board of Irrigation, especially one highly conscientious and musical family. All the daughters played on stringed instruments, and Alexei Alexandrovich knew the family and had stood godfather to one of the elder daughters. The raising of this question by a hostile department was, in Alexei Alexandrovich's opinion, a dishonorable proceeding, seeing that in every department there were things similar and worse, which no one inquired into for well-known reasons of official etiquette. However, now that the glove had been thrown down to him, he had boldly picked it up and demanded the appointment of a special commission to investigate and verify the working of the Board of Irrigation of the lands in the Tsarist province. But in compensation, he gave no quarter to the enemy either. He demanded the appointment of another special commission to inquire into the question of the Native Tribes Organization Committee. The question of the native tribes had been brought up incidentally in the commission of June 2nd, and had been pressed forward actively by Alexei Alexandrovich as one admitting of no delay on account of the deplorable condition of the native tribes in the commission. This question had been a ground of contention between several departments. The department hostile to Alexei Alexandrovich proved that the condition of the native tribes was exceedingly flourishing, that the proposed reconstruction might be the ruin of their prosperity, and that if there were anything wrong, it arose mainly from the failure on the part of Alexei Alexandrovich's department to carry out the measures prescribed by law. Now Alexei Alexandrovich intended to demand first that a new commission should be formed which should be empowered to investigate the condition of the native tribes on the spot. Secondly, if it should appear that the condition of the native tribes actually was such as it appeared to be from the official documents in the hands of the committee, that another new scientific commission should be appointed to investigate the deplorable conditions of the native tribes from the 1 political to administrative, 3 economic, 4 ethnographical, 5 material, and 6 religious points of view. Thirdly, that evidence should be required from the rival department of the measures that had been taken during the last 10 years by that department for averting the disastrous conditions in which the native tribes were now placed. And fourthly, and finally, that department explain why it had as appeared from the evidence before the committee from No. 17,015 Dean and 18,038 from December 5, 1863 and June 7, 1860 for acted in direct contravention of the extent of the law T Act 18 and the note to Act 36. A flash of eagerness suffused the face of Alexei Alexandrovich as he rapidly wrote out a synopsis of these ideas for his own benefit. Having filled a sheet of paper, he got up, rang, and sent a note to the chief secretary of his department to look up certain necessary facts for him. Getting up and walking about the room, he glanced again at the portrait, frowned, and smiled contemptuously after reading a little more of the book on Egyptian hieroglyphics and renewing his interest in it. Alexei Alexandrovich went to bed at 11 o'clock, and recollecting as he lay in bed the incident with his wife, he saw it now in by no means such a gloomy light. Chapter 15. Though Anna had obstinately and with exasperation contradicted Vronsky when he told her their position was impossible, at the bottom of her heart she regarded her own position as false and dishonorable, and she longed with her whole soul to change it. On the way home from the races she had told her husband the truth in a moment of excitement, and in spite of the agony she had suffered in doing so, she was glad of it. After her husband had left her, she told herself that she was glad that now everything was made clear, and at least there would be no more lying and deception. It seemed to her beyond doubt that her position was now made clear forever. It might be bad, this new position, but it would be clear. There would be no indefiniteness or falsehood about it. The pain she'd caused herself and her husband in uttering those words would be rewarded now by everything being made clear. She thought that evening she saw Vronsky, but she did not tell him of what had passed between her and her husband. Though to make the position definite it was necessary to tell him. When she woke up next morning, the first thing that rose to her mind was what she had said to her husband, and those words seemed to her so awful that she could not conceive now how she could have brought herself to utter those strange, coarse words, and could not imagine what would come of it. But the words were spoken, and Alexei Alexandrovich had gone away without saying anything. I saw Vronsky and did not tell him at the very instant he was going away. I would have turned him back and told him, but I changed my mind because it was strange that I had not told him the first minute. Why was it I wanted to tell him and did not tell him? And in answer to this question a burning blush of shame spread over her face. She knew what had kept her from it. She knew that she had been ashamed. Her position, which had seemed to her simplified the night before, suddenly struck her now as not simple but as absolutely hopeless. She felt terrified at the disgrace of what she had not ever thought before. Directly she thought of what her husband would do, the most terrible ideas came to her mind. She had a vision of being turned out of the house, of her shame being proclaimed to all the world. She asked herself where she should go when she was turned out of the house, and she could not find an answer. When she thought of Vronsky, it seemed to her that he did not love her, that he was already beginning to be tired of her, that she could not offer herself to him, and she felt bitter against him for it. It seemed to her that the words that she had spoken to her husband and had continually repeated in her imagination she had said to everyone, and everyone had heard them. She could not bring herself to look those of her own household in the face. She could not bring herself to call her maid, and still less go downstairs and see her son and his governess the maid, who had been listening at the door for a long while, came into her room of her own accord. Anna glanced inquiringly into her face and blushed with a scared look. The maid begged her pardon for coming and saying that she had fancied the bell rang. She brought her clothes and a note. The note was from Betsy. Betsy reminded her that Liza Merkulova and Baroness Stoltz were coming to play croquet with her that morning, with their adorers Koluski and old Stramov come, if only as a study in morals. I shall expect you, she finished. Anna read the note and heaved a deep sigh. Nothing, I need nothing, she said to Anishka, who was rearranging the bottles and brushes on the dressing table. You can go, I'll dress at once and come down. I need nothing. Anishka went out, but Anna did not begin dressing and sat in the same position, her head and hands hanging listlessly, and every now and then she shivered all over, seemed as though she would make some gesture, utter some word, and sink back into lifelessness again. She repeated continually, my God, my God. But neither God nor my had any meaning to her. The idea of seeking help in her difficulty in religion was as remote from her as seeking help from Alexei Alexandrovich himself. Although she had never had doubts of the faith in which she had been brought up, she knew that the support of religion was possible only upon condition of renouncing what made up for her the whole meaning of life. She was not simply miserable. She began to feel alarm at the new spiritual condition, never experienced before, in which she found herself. She felt as though everything were beginning to double in her soul, just as objects sometimes appear doubled over. Tired eyes, she hardly knew at times what it was she feared and what she hoped for, whether she feared or desired what had happened or what was going to happen, and exactly what she longed for she could not have said. Ah, what am I doing, she said to herself, feeling a sudden thrill of pain on both sides of her head. When she came to herself, she saw that she was holding her hair in both hands, each side of her temples, and pulling it. She jumped up and began walking about. The coffee is ready, and Mademoiselle and Serezhka are waiting, said Inishka, coming back again and finding Anna in the same position. Sereza, what about Sereza? Anna asked with sudden eagerness, recollecting her son's existence for the first time. That morning he's been naughty, I think, answered Inushka with a smile. In what way? Some peaches were lying on the table in the corner room. I think he slipped in and ate one of them on the sly. The recollection of her son suddenly roused Anna from the helpless condition in which she found herself. She recalled the partly sincere, though greatly exaggerated, role of the mother living for her child, which she had taken up of late years, and she felt with joy that in the plight in which she found herself, she had a support quite apart from her relation to her husband or to Vronsky. The support was her son. In whatever position she might be placed, she could not lose her son. Her husband might put her to shame and turn her out. Vronsky might grow cold to her and go on living his own life apart. She thought of him again with bitterness and reproach. She could not leave her son. She had an aim in life, and she must act to secure this relation to her son, so that he might not be taken from her quickly. Indeed, as quickly as possible she must take action. Before he was taken from her, she must take her son and go away. Here was the one thing she had to do now. She needed consolation. She must be calm and get out of this insufferable position. The thought of immediate action binding her to her son, of going away somewhere with him, gave her this consolation. She dressed quickly, went downstairs, and with resolute steps walked into the drawing room, where she found, as usual, waiting for her the coffee Seriosha and his governess Seriosha, all in white, with his back and head bent, was standing at a table under a looking glass, and with an expression of intense concentration, which she knew well and in which he resembled his father. He was doing something to the flowers he carried. The governess had a particularly severe expression. Seriosha screamed shrilly, as he often did, "Ah, Mama," and stopped, hesitating whether to go to greet his mother and put down the flowers, or to finish making the wreath and go with the flowers. The governess, after saying good morning, began a long and detailed account of Sophia's naughtiness, but Anna did not hear her. She was considering whether she would take her with her or not. "No, I won't take her," she decided. "I'll go alone with my child." "Yes, it's very wrong," said Anna, and taking her son by the shoulder, she looked at him, not severely, but with a timid glance that Bewildered and delighted the boy, and she kissed him. "Leave him to me," she said to the astonished governess, and not letting go of her son, she sat down at the table where coffee was set ready for her mama. "I didn't," he said, trying to make out from her expression what was in store for him in regard to the peaches. "Seriosha," she said as soon as the governess had left the room. "That was wrong, but you'll never do it again. Will you love me?" She felt that the tears were coming into her eyes. "Can I help loving him?" she said to herself, looking deeply into his scared and at the same time delighted eyes. "And can he ever join his father in punishing me? Is it possible he will not feel for me?" Tears were already flowing down her face, and to hide them she got up abruptly and almost ran out onto the terrace after the thunder showers of the last few days. Cold, bright weather had set and the air was cold, and the bright sun that filtered through the freshly washed leaves. She shivered both from the cold and from the inward horror which had clutched her with fresh force in the open air. "Run along to Marriott," she said to Saria, who had followed her out, and she began walking up and down on the straw matting of the terrace. "Can it be that they won't forgive me, won't understand how it all couldn't be helped?" she said to herself, standing still and looking at the tops of the aspen trees waving in the wind with their freshly washed, brightly shining leaves in the cold sunshine. She knew that they would not forgive her, that everyone and everything would be merciless to her now, as was that sky, that green, and again she felt that everything was split into in her soul. "I mustn't think," she said to herself. "I must get ready to go. Where, when, whom to take with me? Yes, to Moscow by the evening train, Anishka and Sergei, and only the most necessary things. But first I must write to them both." She went quickly indoors into her boudoir, sat down at the table, and wrote to her husband, "After what has happened, I cannot remain any longer in your house. I am going away and taking my son with me. I don't know the law, and so I don't know with which of the parents the son should remain, but I take him with me because I cannot live without him. Be generous, leave him to me." Up to this point she wrote rapidly and naturally, but the appeal to his generosity, a quality she did not recognize in him, and the necessity of winding up the letter with something touching pulled her up. "Of my fault and my remorse I cannot speak," because she stopped again, finding no connection in her ideas. "No," she said to herself, "there's no need of anything," and tearing up the letter she wrote it again, leaving out the allusion to generosity, and sealed it up. Another letter had to be written to Vronsky. "I have told my husband," she wrote, and she sat a long while unable to write more. It was so coarse, so unfeminine, and what more am I to write to him? She said to herself. Again a flush of shame spread over her face. She recalled his composure, and a feeling of anger against him impelled her to tear the sheet with the phrase she had written into tiny bits. "No need of anything," she said to herself, and closing her blotting case, she went upstairs, told the governess and the servants that she was going that day to Moscow, and at once set to work to pack up her things. Chapter 16. All the rooms of the summer villa were full of porters, gardeners, and footmen going to and fro carrying out things. Cupboards and chests were opened twice. They'd sent to the shop for cord. Pieces of newspaper were tossing about on the floor too. Trunks and bags and strapped-up rugs had been carried down into the hall. The carriage and to hired cabs were waiting at the steps. Anna, forgetting her inward agitation in the work of packing, was standing at a table in her boudoir packing her traveling bag when Anishka called her attention to the rattle of some carriage driving up. Anna looked out of the window and saw Alexei Alexandrovich's courier on the steps, ringing at the front doorbell. "Run and find out what it is," she said, and with a calm sense of being prepared for anything she sat down in a low chair, folding her hands on her knees. A footman brought in a thick packet directed in Alexei Alexandrovich's hand. The courier's orders to wait for an answer. He said, "Very well," she said, and as soon as he had left the room she tore open the letter with trembling fingers. A roll of unfolded notes done up in a wrapper fell out of it. She disengaged the letter and began reading it. At the end, "Preparations shall be made for your arrival here. I attach particular significance to compliance." She read, she ran on, then back, read it all through, and once more read the letter all through again from the beginning. When she had finished she felt that she was cold all over, and that a fearful calamity such as she had not expected had burst upon her in the morning. She had regretted that she had spoken to her husband and wished for nothing so much as that those words could be unspoken. And here this letter regarded them as unspoken and gave her what she had wanted. But now this letter seemed to her more awful than anything she had been able to conceive. "He's right," she said. "Of course, he's always right. He's a Christian. He's generous, yes, vile, base creature, and no one understands it except me, and no one ever will, and I can't explain it. They say he's so religious, so high-principled, so upright, so clever. But they don't see what I've seen. They don't know how he has crushed my life for 8 years, crushed everything that was living in me. He's not once even thought that I'm a live woman who must have love. They don't know how at every step he's humiliated me and been just as pleased with himself. Haven't I striven with all my strength to find something to give meaning to my life? Haven't I struggled to love him, to love my son when I could not love my husband? But the time came when I knew that I couldn't cheat myself any longer, that I was alive, that I was not to blame, that God has made me so that I must love and live. And now what does he do? If he'd killed me, if he'd killed him, I could have borne anything, I could have forgiven anything. But no, how was it I didn't guess what he would do? He's doing just what's characteristic of his mean character. He'll keep himself in the right while me and my ruin he'll drive still lower to worse ruin. Yet she recalled the words from the letter. "You can conjecture what awaits you and your son. That's a threat to take away my child, and most likely by their stupid law he can. But I know very well why he says it. He doesn't believe even in my love for my child, or he despises it just as he always used to ridicule it. He despises that feeling in me. But he knows that I won't abandon my child, that I can't abandon my child, that there could be no life for me without my child, even with him whom I love. But that if I abandoned my child and ran away from him, I should be acting like the most infamous, basest of women. He knows that, and knows that I'm incapable of doing that." She recalled another sentence in the letter: "Our life must go on, as it has done in the past. That life was miserable enough in the old days. It's been awful of late. What will it be now?" He knows all that. He knows that I can't repent, that I breathe, that I love. He knows that it can lead to nothing but lying and deceit. But he wants to go on torturing. May I know him? I know that he's at home and is happy in deceit, like a fish swimming in the water. No, I won't give him that happiness. I'll break through the spider web of lies in which he wants to catch me. Come, what may anything's better than lying and deceit? But how, my God, was ever a woman so miserable as I am? No, I will break through it. I will break through it," she cried, jumping up and keeping back her tears. And she went to the writing table to write him another letter. But at the bottom of her heart, she felt that she was not strong enough to break through anything, that she was not strong enough to get out of her old position, however false and dishonorable it might be. She sat down at the writing table, but instead of writing, she clasped her hands on the table, and laying her head on them, burst into tears with sobs and heaving breast like a child crying. She was weeping that her dream of her position, being made clear and definite, had been annihilated forever. She knew beforehand that everything would go on in the old way, and far worse indeed than in the old way. She felt that the position in the world that she enjoyed, and that had seemed to her of so little consequence in the morning, that this position was precious to her, that she would not have the strength to exchange it for the shameful position of a woman who has abandoned husband and child to join her lover, that however much she might struggle, she could not be stronger than herself. She would never know freedom and love, but would remain forever a guilty wife, with the menace of detection hanging over her at every instant, deceiving her husband for the sake of a shameful connection with a man living apart and away from her, whose life she could never share. She knew that this was how it would be, and at the same time, it was so awful that she could not even conceive what it would end in. And she cried without restraint, as children cry when they are punished. The sound of the footman's steps forced her to rouse herself, and hiding her face from him, she pretended to be writing. The courier asks if there's an answer. The footman announced an answer. "Yes," said Anna. "Let him wait, I'll ring. What can I write?" she thought. "What can I decide upon alone? What do I do? What do I want? What is there I care for?" Again she felt that her soul was beginning to be split into. She was terrified again at this feeling, and Clutched at the first pretext for doing something which might divert her thoughts from herself. I ought to see Alexei. So she called Vronsky. In her thoughts, no one. But he can tell me what I ought to do. I'll go to Betsy's. Perhaps I shall see him there, she said to herself, completely forgetting that when she had told him the day before that she was not going to Princess Vrshika's, he had said that in that case he should not go either. She went up to the table, wrote to her husband, "I have received your letter, and ringing the bell gave it to the footman. We're not going," she said to Anishka as she came in. "Not going at all. No, don't unpack until tomorrow and let the carriage wait. I'm going to the princess's. Which dress am I to get ready?" Chapter 17. The coquettish party to which the Princess Vrskaya had invited Anna was to consist of 2 ladies and their adorers. These 2 ladies were the chief representatives of a select New Petersburg circle, nicknamed in imitation of some imitation, La Petite Merveille d'Europe. These ladies belonged to a circle which, though of the highest society, was utterly hostile to that in which Anna moved. Moreover, Stremov, one of the most influential people in Petersburg and the elderly admirer of Liza Merkelova, was Alexei Alexandrovich's enemy in the political world. From all these considerations, Anna had not meant to go, and the hints in Princess Vrshika's note referred to her refusal. But now Anna was eager to go in the hope of seeing Vronsky. Anna arrived at Princess Vrskaya's earlier than the other guests. At the same moment as she entered, Vronsky's footman, with side whiskers combed out like a cameraman, went in. He stopped at the door and, taking off his cap, let her pass. Anna recognized him and only then recalled that Vronsky had told her the day before that he would not come. Most likely he was sending a note to say so. As she took off her outer garment in the hall, she heard the footman pronouncing his R's even like a cameraowner say from the count for the princess, and hand the note. She longed to question him as to where his master was. She longed to turn back and send him a letter to come and see her, or to go herself to see him. But neither the first nor the second nor the third course was possible. Already she heard bells ringing to announce her arrival ahead of her, and Princess Vrskaya's footman was standing at the open door waiting for her to go forward into the inner rooms. "The princess is in the garden. They will inform her immediately. Would you be pleased to walk into the garden?" announced another footman. In another room, the position of uncertainty, of indecision, was still the same as at home. Worse, in fact, since it was impossible to take any step, impossible to see Vronsky, and she had to remain here among outsiders and company so uncongenial to her present mood. But she was wearing a dress that she knew suited her. She was not alone. All around was that luxurious setting of idleness that she was used to, and she felt less wretched than at home. She was not forced to think what she was to do. Everything would be done of itself. On meeting Betsy coming towards her in a white gown that struck her by its elegance, Anna smiled at her just as she always did. Princess Vrskaya was walking with Tushkevich and a young lady, a relation, who, to the great joy of her parents in the provinces, was spending the summer with the fashionable princess. There was probably something unusual about Anna, for Betsy noticed it at once. "I slept badly," answered Anna, looking intently at the footman who came to meet them, and as she supposed brought Vronsky's note. "How glad I am you've come," said Betsy. "I'm tired and was just longing to have some tea before they come. You might go," she turned to Tushkevich, "with Masha, and try the croquet ground over there where they've been cutting it. We shall have time to talk a little over tea. We'll have a cozy chat," she said in English to Anna, with a smile, pressing the hand with which she held a parasol. "Yes, especially as I can't stay very long with you. I'm forced to go on to old Madame Frida. I've been promising to go for a century," said Anna, to whom lying alien, as it was to her nature, had become not merely simple and natural in society, but a positive source of satisfaction. Why she said this, which she had not thought of a second before, she could not have explained. She had said it simply from the reflection that as Vronsky would not be here, she'd better secure her own freedom and try to see him somehow. But why she had spoken of old Madame Vrede, whom she had to go and see as she had to see many other people, she could not have explained. And yet, as it afterwards turned out, had she contrived the most cunning devices to meet Vronsky, she could have thought of nothing better. "No, "I'm not going to let you go for anything," answered Betsy, looking intently into Anna's face. "Really, if I were not fond of you, I should feel offended. One would think you were afraid my society would compromise you." Tea in the little dining room. "Please," she said, half closing her eyes, as she always did when addressing the footman. Taking the note from him, she read it. "Alexei's playing us false," she said in French. "He writes that he can't come," she added in a tone as simple and natural, as though it could never enter her head that Vronsky could mean anything more to Anna than a game of croquet. Anna knew that Betsy knew everything, but hearing how she spoke of Vronsky before her, she almost felt persuaded for a minute that she knew nothing. Said Anna indifferently, as though not greatly interested in the matter, and she went on smiling. "How can you or your friends compromise anyone?" This playing with words, this hiding of a secret, had a great fascination for Anna, as indeed it has for all women, and it was not the necessity of concealment, not the aim with which the concealment was contrived, but the process of concealment itself which attracted her. "I can't be more Catholic than the Pope," she said. Stremov and Liza Merkovova, why, they're the cream of society. Besides, they're received everywhere. And she laid special stress on the "I have never been strict and intolerant. It's simply that I haven't the time." "No, you don't care perhaps to meet Stremov. Let him and Alexei Alexandrovich tilt at each other in the committee. That's no affair of ours. But in the world he's the most amiable man I know, and a devoted croquet player, you shall see. And in spite of his absurd position as Liza's love-sick swain at his age, you ought to see how he carries off the absurd position. He's very nice, Sappho Stolz. You don't know? Oh, that's a new type, quite new." Betsy said all this, and at the same time, from her good-humored, shrewd glance, Anna felt that she partly guessed her plight, and was hatching something for her benefit. They were in the little boulevard. "I must write to Alexei, though," and Betsy sat down to the table, scribbled a few lines, and put the note in the envelope. "I'm telling him to come to dinner. I've one lady extra to dinner with me, and no man to take her. And look what I've said. Will that persuade him?" "Excuse me, I must leave you for a minute. Would you seal it up, please, and send it off?" she said from the door. "I have to give some directions." Without a moment's thought, Anna sat down to the table with Betsy's letter, and without reading it, wrote below, "It's essential for me to see you come to the Verd Garden. I shall be there at 6 o'clock. She sealed it up, and Betsy, coming back in her presence, handed the note to be taken a tea, which was brought them on a little tea table in the cool little drawing room, the cozy chat promised by Princess Verskaya. Before the arrival of her visitors really did come off between the two women, they criticized the people they were expecting, and the conversation fell upon Liza Merkelova. "She's very sweet, and I always liked her," said Anna, "when you ought to like her. She raves about you. Yesterday she came up to me after the races and was in despair at not finding you. She says you're a real heroine of romance, and that if she were a man she would do all sorts of mad things for your sake. Stremov says she does that as it is. But do tell me, please." "I could never make it out," said Anna, after being silent for some time, speaking in a tone that showed she was not asking an idle question, but that what she was asking was of more importance to her than it should have been. "Do tell me, please, what are her relations with Prince Kalushki, Mishka, as he's called? I've met them so little. What does it mean?" Betsy smiled with her eyes and looked intently at Anna. "It's a new manner," she said. "They've all adopted that manner. They've flung their caps over the windmills. But there are ways and ways of flinging them, yes. But what are her relations precisely with Kalushki?" Betsy broke into unexpected, mirthful, and irrepressible laughter. "A thing which rarely happened with her. You're encroaching on Princess Miyuki's special domain now. That's the question of an infant. Terrible." And Betsy obviously tried to restrain herself, but could not, and went off into peals of that infectious laughter that people laugh who do not laugh often. "You'd better ask them," she brought out between tears of laughter. "No, you laugh," said Anna, laughing too in spite of herself. "But I never could understand it. I can't understand the husbands roll in it. The husband, Lisa Marklova's husband, carries her shawl and is always ready to be of use. Anything more than that in reality no one cares to inquire. You know, in decent society one doesn't talk or even think of certain details of the toilet. That's how it is with this." "Will you be at Madame Roland Doc's fete?" asked Anna, to change the conversation. "I don't think so," answered Betsy, and without looking at her friend she began filling the little transparent cups with fragrant tea. Putting a cup before Anna, she took out a cigarette and fitting it into a silver holder she lighted it. "It's like this, you see, I'm in a fortunate position," she began, quite serious now as she took up her cup. "I understand you, and I understand Lisa. Lisa now is one of those naive natures that, like children, don't know what's good and what's bad. Anyway, she didn't comprehend it when she was young, and now she's aware that the lack of comprehension suits her now, perhaps. She doesn't know on purpose," said Betsy with a subtle smile. "But anyway, it suits her the very same thing, don't you see? Maybe looked at tragically and turned into a misery. Or it may be looked at simply and even humorously. Possibly you are inclined to look at things too tragically. How I should like to know other people just as I know myself," said Anna seriously. "And dreamily, am I worse than other people? Or better, I think I'm worse." "Alphonse terrible," repeated Betsy. But here they are. Chapter 18. They heard the sound of steps in a man's voice, then a woman's voice and laughter, and immediately thereafter there walked in the expected guests, Sapphic Stoltz, and a young man beaming with excess of health, the so-called Vaska. It was evident that ample supplies of beefsteak, truffles, and burgundy never failed to reach him. At the fitting hour, Vaska bowed to the two ladies and glanced at them, but only for 1 second. He walked after Sappho into the drawing room and followed her about as though he were chained to her, keeping his sparkling eyes fixed on her as though he wanted to eat her. Sepp Stoltz was a blonde beauty with black eyes. She walked with smart little steps and high-heeled shoes and shook hands with the ladies vigorously like a man. Anna had never met this new star of fashion and was struck by her beauty, the exaggerated extreme to which her dress was carried, and the boldness of her manners on her head. There was such a superstructure of soft golden hair, her own and false mixed, that her head was equal in size to the elegantly rounded bust of which so much was exposed in front. The impulsive abruptness of her movements was such that at every step the lines of her knees and the upper part of her legs were distinctly marked under her dress, and the question involuntarily rose to the mind, where in the undulating piled-up mountain of material at the back the real body of the woman, so small and slender, so naked in front, and so hidden behind and below, really came to an end. Betsy made haste to introduce her to Anna. "Only fancy, we all but ran over to soldiers," she began telling them at once, using her eyes, smiling and twitching away her tail, which she flung back at one stroke, "all on one side. I drove here with Vaska. Ought to be sure you don't know each other." And mentioning his surname, she introduced the young man, and reddening a little broke into a ringing laugh at her mistake, that is, at having called him Vaska to a stranger. Fascia bowed once more to Anna, but he said nothing to her. He addressed Sappho. "You've lost your bet. We got here first. Pay up," he said, smiling. Sappho laughed still more festively. "Not just now," said she. "Oh, all right, I'll have it later." Very well, very well. "Oh yes." She turned suddenly to Princess Betsy. "I am a nice person. I positively forgot it. I've brought you a visitor, and here he comes." The unexpected young visitor whom Sappho had invited and whom she had forgotten was, however, a personage of such consequence that in spite of his youth both the ladies rose on his entrance. He was a new admirer of Sappho's. He now dogged her footsteps. Like Vaska, soon after Prince Kalushki arrived in Lisa Merkulova with Strumov. Lisa Merkulova was a thin brunette with an oriental languid type of face, and, as everyone used to say, exquisite enigmatic eyes. The tone of her dark dress, Anna immediately observed and appreciated. The fact was in perfect harmony with her style of beauty. Lisa was as soft and enervated as Sappho was smart and abrupt, but to Anna's taste Lisa was far more attractive. Betsy had said to Anna that she had adopted the pose of an innocent child, but when Anna saw her she felt that this was not the truth. She really was both innocent and corrupt, but a sweet and passive woman. It is true that her tone was the same as Sappho's, that like Sappho she had two men, one young and one old, tacked onto her and devouring her with their eyes. But there was something in her higher than what surrounded her. There was in her the glow of the real diamond among glass imitations. This glow shone out in her exquisite, truly enigmatic eyes, the weary and at the same time passionate glance of those eyes encircled by dark rings impressed one by its perfect sincerity. Everyone looking into those eyes fancied he knew her wholly, and knowing her could not but love her at the sight of Anna. Her whole face lighted up at once with a smile of delight. "Ah, how glad I am to see you," she said, going up to her yesterday at the races. "All I wanted was to get to you. But you'd gone away, I did. So want to see you yesterday, especially, wasn't it awful?" she said, looking at Anna with eyes that seemed to lay bare all her soul. "Yes, I had no idea it would be so thrilling," said Anna, blushing. The company got up at this moment to go into the garden. "I'm not going," said Lisa, smiling and settling herself close to Anna. "You won't go either, will you? Who wants to play croquet?" "Oh, I like it," said Anna. "Fair. How do you manage never to be bored by things? It's delightful to look at you. You're alive, but I'm bored." "How can you be bored while you live in the liveliest set in Petersburg?" said Anna. "Possibly the people who are not of our set are even more bored. But I certainly are not happy, but awfully bored." Sappho, smoking a cigarette, went off into the garden with the two young men. Betsy and Stremov remained at the tea table. "What bored?" said Betsy. "Sappho says they did enjoy themselves tremendously at your house last night." "Ah, how dreary it all was," said Lisa Mercala. "We all drove back to my place after the races, and always the same people, always the same thing. We lounged about on sofas all the evening. What is there to enjoy in that now? Do tell me, how do you manage never to be bored?" she said, addressing Anna again. "One has but to look at you, and one sees here's a woman who may be happy or unhappy, but isn't bored. Tell me, how do you do it?" "I do nothing," answered Anna, blushing at these searching questions. "That's the best way." Stremov put in. Stromov was a man of 50, partly gray, but still vigorous, looking very ugly, but with a characteristic and intelligent face. Liza Markalova was his wife's niece, and he spent all of his leisure hours with her. On meeting Anna Karenina, as he was Alexei Alexandrovich's enemy in the government, he tried, like a shrewd man and a man of the world, to be particularly cordial with her, the wife of his enemy. "Nothing," he put in with a subtle smile. "That's the very best way. I told you long ago," he said, turning to Lisa Mercala, "that if you don't want to be bored, you mustn't think you're going to be bored. It's just as you mustn't be afraid of not being able to fall asleep. If you're afraid of sleeplessness, that's just what an Arkadiev just said. I should be very glad if I had said it, for it's not only clever, but true," said Anna, smiling. "No, do tell me why it is one can't go to sleep, and one can't help being bored. To sleep well, one ought to work, and to enjoy oneself, one ought to work. To what am I to work for when my work is no use to anybody? And I can't and won't knowingly make a pretense about it." "You're incorrigible," said Stremov, not looking at her, and he spoke again to Anna. As he rarely met Anna, he could say nothing but commonplaces to her, but he said those commonplaces as to when she was returning to Petersburg, and how fond Countess Lydia Ivanovna was of her, with an expression which suggested that he longed with his whole soul to please her and show his regard for her. And even more than that, Tushkovich came in, announcing that the party were awaiting the other players to begin croquet. "No, don't go away, please don't," pleaded Lisa Merkalova. Hearing that Anna was going, Stremov joined in her entreaties. "It's too violent a transition," he said, "to go from such company to old Madame Frieder, and besides, you will only give her a chance for talking scandal, while here you arouse none but such different feelings of the highest and most opposite kind," he said to her. Anna pondered for an instant in uncertainty the shrewd man's flattering words, the naive childlike affection shown her by Lisa Merkalova, and all the social atmosphere she was used to. It was all so easy, and what was in store for her was so difficult that she was for a minute in uncertainty whether to remain, whether to put off a little longer the painful moment of explanation. But remembering what was in store for her alone at home, if she did not come to some decision, remembering that gesture, terrible even in memory, when she had clutched her hair in both hands, she said goodbye and went away. Chapter 19. In spite of Vronsky's apparently frivolous life in society, he was a man who hated irregularity. In early youth, in the course of pages, he had experienced the humiliation of a refusal when he had tried, being in difficulties, to borrow money, and since then he had never once put himself in the same position again. In order to keep his affairs in some sort of order, he used about 5 times a year, more or less frequently according to circumstances, to shut himself up alone and put all his affairs into definite shape. This he used to call his day of reckoning, or faire la lessive. On waking up the day after the races, Vronsky put on a white linen coat, and without shaving or taking his bath, he distributed about the table money's bills and letters and set to work. Petritsky, who knew he was ill-tempered on such occasions, on waking up and seeing his comrade at the writing table quietly dressed, and went out without getting in his way. Every man who knows to the minutest details all the complexity of the conditions surrounding him cannot help imagining that the complexity of these conditions and the difficulty of making them clear is something exceptional and personal, peculiar to himself, and never supposes that others are surrounded by just as complicated an array of personal affairs as he is. So indeed it seemed to Vronsky, and not without inward pride, and not without reason, he thought that any other man would long ago have been in difficulties, would have been forced to some dishonorable course if he had found himself in such a difficult position. But Vronsky felt that now especially it was essential for him to clear up and define his position if he were to avoid getting into difficulties. What Vronsky attacked first as being the easiest was his pecuniary position, writing out on notepaper in his minute hand all that he owed. He added up the amount and found that his debts amounted to 17,000 and some odd hundreds, which he left out. For the sake of clearness, reckoning up his money and his bank book, he found that he had left 1,800 rubles and nothing coming in before the New Year. Reckoning over again his list of debts, Vronsky copied it, dividing it into 3 classes. In the first class he put the debts which he would have to pay at once, or for which he must in any case have the money ready, so that on demand for payment there could not be a moment's delay in paying. Such debts amounted to about 4,000 to 1,500 for a horse and 2,500 as surety for a young comrade Vinovsky, who had lost that sum to a card sharper in Vronsky's presence. Vronsky had wanted to pay the money at the time. He had that amount then, but Vinovsky and Yashvin had insisted that they would pay, and not Vronsky, who had not played that was so far well. But Vronsky knew that in this dirty business, though his only share in it was undertaking by word of mouth to be surety for Vinovsky, it was absolutely necessary for him to have the 2,500 rubles so as to be able to fling it at the swindler and have no more words with him. And so for this first and most important division, he must have 4,000 rubles. The second class 8,000 rubles consisted of less important debts. These were principally accounts owing in connection with his race horses to the purveyor of oats and hay, the English saddler, and so on. He would have to pay some 2,000 rubles on these debts too, in order to be quite free from anxiety. The last class of debts to shops, to hotels, to his tailor were such as need not be considered, so that he needed at least 6,000 rubles for current expenses, and he had only 1,800 for a man with 100,000 rubles of revenue, which was what everyone fixed as Vronsky's income. Such debts, one would suppose, could hardly be embarrassing. But the fact was that he was far from having 100,000. His father's immense property, which alone yielded a yearly income of 200,000, was left undivided between the brothers at the time, when the elder brother, with a mass of debts, married Princess Varia Surkova, the daughter of a Decembrist, without any fortune whatever. Alexei had given up to his elder brother almost the whole income from his father's estate, reserving for himself only 25,000 a year from it. Alexei had said at the time to his brother that that sum would be sufficient for him until he married, which he probably never would do, and his brother, who was in command of one of the most expensive regiments and was only just married, could not decline the gift. His mother, who had her own separate property, had allowed Alexei every year 20,000, in addition to the 25,000 he had reserved, and Alexei had spent it all of late. His mother, incensed with him on account of his love affair and his leaving Moscow, had given up sending him the money, and in consequence of this, Vronsky, who had been in the habit of living on the scale of 45,000 a year, having only received 20,000 that year, found himself now in difficulties. To get out of these difficulties, he could not apply to his mother for money. Her last letter, which he had received the day before, had particularly exasperated him by the hints in it that she was quite ready to help him to succeed in the world and in the army, but not to lead a life which was a scandal to all good society. His mother's attempt to buy him stung him to the quick and made him feel colder than ever to her. But he could not draw back from the generous word when it was once uttered, even though he felt now vaguely foreseeing certain eventualities in his intrigue with Madame Karenina, that this generous word had been spoken thoughtlessly, and that even though he were not married he might need all the 100,000 of income. But it was impossible to draw back. He had only to recall his brother's wife, to remember how that sweet, delightful Varia sought at every convenient opportunity to remind him that she remembered his generosity and appreciated it, to grasp the impossibility of taking back his gift. It was as impossible as beating a woman, stealing, or lying. One thing only could and ought to be done, and Vronsky determined upon it without an instant's hesitation: to borrow money from a money lender, 10,000 rubles a proceeding, which presented no difficulty, to cut down his expenses generally, and to sell his racehorses. Resolving on this, he promptly wrote a note to Roland Dack, who had more than once sent to him with offers to buy horses from him. Then he sent for the Englishman and the money lender, and divided what money he had according to the accounts he intended to pay. Having finished this business, he wrote a cold and cutting answer to his mother. Then he took out of his notebook 3 notes of Anna's, read them again, burned them, and remembering their conversation on the previous day, he sank into meditation. Chapter 20. Vronsky's life was particularly happy, and that he had a code of principles which defined with unfailing certitude what he ought and what he ought not to do. This code of principles covered only a very small circle of contingencies. But then the principles were never doubtful, and Vronsky, as he never went outside that circle, had never had a moment's hesitation about doing what he ought to do. These principles laid down as invariable rules that one must pay a card sharper but need not pay a tailor, that one must never tell a lie to a man, but one may to a woman, that one must never cheat anyone, but one may a husband, that one must never pardon an insult, but one may give one, and so on. These principles were possibly not reasonable and not good, but they were of unfailing certainty, and so long as he adhered to them, Vronsky felt that his heart was at peace, and he could hold his head up. Only quite lately, in regard to his relations with Anna, Vronsky had begun to feel that his code of principles did not fully cover all possible contingencies, and to foresee in the future difficulties and perplexities for which he could find no guiding clue. His present relation to Anna and to her husband was to his mind clear and simple. It was clearly and precisely defined in the code of principles by which he was guided. She was an honorable woman who had bestowed her love upon him, and he loved her, and therefore she was in his eyes a woman who had a right to the same or even more respect than a lawful wife. He would have had his hand chopped off before he would have allowed himself by a word, by a hint, to humiliate her, or even to fall short of the fullest respect a woman could look for. His attitude to society, to was clear. Everyone might know, might suspect it, but no one might dare to speak of it. If any did so, he was ready to force all who might speak to be silent and to respect the non-existent honor of the woman he loved. His attitude to the husband was the clearest of all. From the moment that Anna loved Vronsky, he had regarded his own right over her as the one thing unassailable. Her husband was simply a superfluous and tiresome person. No doubt he was in a pitiable position, but how could that be helped? The one thing the husband had a right to was to demand satisfaction with a weapon in his hand, and Vronsky was prepared for this at any minute. But of late new inner relations had arisen between him and her which frightened Vronsky by their indefiniteness. Only the day before she'd told him that she was with child, and he felt that this fact and what she expected of him called for something not fully defined in that code of principles by which he had hitherto steered his course in life, and he had been indeed caught unawares. And at the first moment when she spoke to him of her position, his heart had prompted him to beg her to leave her husband. He had said that, but now, thinking things over, he saw clearly that it would be better to manage to avoid that, and at the same time, as he told himself so, he was afraid whether it was not wrong. If I told her to leave her husband, that must mean uniting her life with mine. Am I prepared for that? How can I take her away now when I have no money? Supposing I could arrange, but how can I take her away while I'm in the service? If I say that, I ought to be prepared to do it. That is, I ought to have the money and to retire from the army. And he grew thoughtful. The question whether to retire from the service or not brought him to the other, and perhaps the chief though hidden interest of his life, of which none knew. But ambition was the old dream of his youth and childhood, a dream which he did not confess even to himself, though it was so strong that now this passion was even doing battle with his love, his first steps in the world and in the service had been successful, but 2 years before he had made a great mistake. Anxious to show his independence and to advance, he had refused a post that had been offered him, hoping that this refusal would heighten his value. But it turned out that he had been too bold, and he was passed over, and having, whether he liked it or not, taken up for himself the position of an independent man, he carried it off with great tact and good sense, behaving as though he bore no grudge against anyone, did not regard himself as injured in any way, and cared for nothing but to be left alone. Since he was enjoying himself, in reality, he had ceased to enjoy himself as long ago as the year before. When he went away to Moscow, he felt that this independent attitude of a man who might have done anything but cared to do nothing was already beginning to pall, that many people were beginning to fancy that he was not really capable of anything but being a straightforward, good-natured fellow. His connection with Madame Karenina, by creating so much sensation and attracting general attention, had given him a fresh distinction which soothed his gnawing worm of ambition for a while. But a week before, that worm had been roused up again with fresh force. The friend of his childhood, a man of the same set, of the same coterie, his comrade in the corps of pages, Sapkovsky, who had left school with him and had been his rival in class and gymnastics, in their scraps and their dreams of glory, had come back a few days before from Central Asia, where he had gained 2 steps up in rank, and an order rarely bestowed upon generals so young. As soon as he arrived in Petersburg, people began to talk about him as a newly risen star of the first magnitude, a school fellow of Vronsky's, and of the same age. He was a general and was expecting a command which might have influence on the course of political events, while Vronsky, independent and brilliant and beloved by a charming woman, though he was simply a cavalry captain who was readily allowed to be as independent as ever he liked. Of course, I don't envy Sapkovsky, and never could envy him, but his advancement shows me that one has only to watch one's opportunity, and the career of a man like me may be very rapidly made. 3 years ago he was in just the same position as I am. If I retire, I burn my ships. If I remain in the army, I lose nothing, she said. Herself, she did not wish to change her position, and with her love I cannot feel envious of Serbukovsky. And slowly twirling his mustaches, he got up from the table and walked about the room. His eyes shone particularly brightly, and he felt in that confident, calm, and happy frame of mind which always came after he had thoroughly faced his position. Everything was straight and clear, just as after former days of reckoning. He shaved, took a cold bath, dressed, and went out. Chapter 21. We've come to fetch you. Your lax have lasted a good time today, said Petritsky. Well, is it over, answered Vronsky, smiling with his eyes only and twirling the tips of his mustaches as circumspectly as though, after the perfect order into which his affairs had been brought, any overbold or rapid movement might disturb it. You're always just as if you'd come out of a bath after it, said Petritsky. I've come from Gretzky's, that was what they called the colonel there, expecting you. Vronsky, without answering, looked at his comrade, thinking of something else. Yes, is that music at his place, he said, listening to the familiar sounds of polkas and waltzes floating across to him. What's the fate, Serpovkovsky has come? Aha, said Vronsky. Why, I didn't know. The smile in his eyes gleamed more brightly than ever, having once made up his mind that he was happy in his love, that he sacrificed his ambition to it, having anyway taken up this position. Vronsky was incapable of feeling either envious of Sergei Pavtsov or hurt with him for not coming first to him when he came to the regiment. Serpukovsky was a good friend, and he was delighted he had come. I'm very glad the Colonel Demon had taken a large country house. The whole party were in the wide lower balcony in the courtyard. The first objects that met Vronsky's eyes were a band of singers in white linen coats standing near a barrel of vodka, and the robust, good-humored figure of the colonel surrounded by officers. He had gone out as far as the first step of the balcony and was loudly shouting across the band that played Offenbach's quadrille, waving his arms and giving some orders to a few soldiers standing on one side. A group of soldiers, a quartermaster, and several subalterns came up to the balcony. With Vronsky, the colonel returned to the table, went out again onto the steps with a tumbler in his hand and proposed the toast to the health of our former comrade, the gallant General Prince Serpukhowskoy. Hurrah! The colonel was followed by Serpukhowsky, who came out onto the steps smiling with a glass in his hand. "You always get younger, Bondarenka," he said to the rosy-cheeked, smart-looking quartermaster standing just before him, still youngish looking though doing his second term of service. It was 3 years since Vronsky had seen Serpukhowsky. He looked more robust, had let his whiskers grow, but was still the same graceful creature whose face and figure were even more striking from their softness and nobility than their beauty. The only change Vronsky detected in him was that subdued continual radiance of beaming content which settles on the faces of men who are successful and are sure of their recognition of their success by everyone. Vronsky knew that radiant air and immediately observed it in Serpukhowsky. As Serpukhowsky came down the steps, he saw Vronsky. A smile of pleasure lighted up his face. He tossed his head upwards and waved the glass in his hand, greeting Vronsky and showing him by the gesture that he could not come to him before the quartermaster, who stood craning forward, his lips ready to be kissed. "Here he is," shouted the colonel. "Yashvin told me you were in one of your gloomy tempers." Serpukhowsky kissed the moist, fresh lips of the gallant-looking quartermaster and, wiping his mouth with his handkerchief, went up to Vronsky. "How glad I am," he said, squeezing his hand and drawing him on one side. "You look after him," the colonel shouted to Yashvin, pointing to Vronsky, and he went down below to the soldiers. "Why weren't you at the races yesterday? I expected to see you there," said Vronsky, scrutinizing Serpukhowsky. "I did go, but late. I beg your pardon," he added, and turned to the adjutant. "Please have this divided from me, each man as much as it runs to," and he hurriedly took notes for 300 rubles from his pocketbook, blushing a little. "Vronsky, have anything to eat or drink? A stashkin high, something for the count to eat. I hear it is have a glass." The fate at the colonel's lasted a long while. There was a great deal of drinking. They tossed Serpukhowsky in the air and caught him again several times. Then they did the same to the colonel. Then, to the accompaniment of the band, the colonel himself danced with Petritsky. Then the colonel, who began to show signs of feebleness, sat down on a bench in the courtyard and began demonstrating to Yashvin the superiority of Russia over Poland, especially in cavalry attack. And there was a lull in the revelry for a moment. Serpukhowsky went into the house to the bathroom to wash his hands and found Vronsky there. Vronsky was drenching his head with water. He had taken off his coat and put his sunburned, hairy neck under the tap and was rubbing it in his head with his hands. When he had finished, Vronsky sat down by Serpukhowsky. They both sat down in the bathroom on a lounge, and a conversation began, which was very interesting to both of them. "I've always been hearing about you through my wife," said Serpukhowsky. "I'm glad you've been seeing her pretty often. She's friendly with Varia, and they're the only women in Petersburg I care about seeing," answered Vronsky, smiling. He was smiling because he foresaw the topic the conversation would turn on, and he was glad of it. "The only one?" Serpukhowsky inquired, smiling. "Yes, and I heard news of you, but not only through your wife," said Vronsky, checking his hint by a stern expression of face. "I was greatly delighted to hear of your successes, but not a bit surprised. I expected even more." Serpukhowsky smiled. Such an opinion of him was obviously agreeable to him, and he did not think it necessary to conceal it. "Well, I on the contrary expected less, I'll own frankly, but I'm glad, very glad. I'm ambitious, that's my weakness, and I confess to it. Perhaps you wouldn't confess to if you hadn't been successful," said Vronsky. "I don't suppose so," said Serpukhowsky, smiling again. "I won't say life wouldn't be worth living without it, but it would be dull. Of course, I may be mistaken, but I fancy I have a certain capacity for the line I've chosen, and that power of any sort in my hands, if it is to be, will be better than in the hands of a good many people I know," said Serpukhowsky with beaming consciousness of success. "And so the nearer I get to it, the better pleased I am. Perhaps that is true for you, but not for everyone. I used to think so too, but here I live and think life worth living. Not only for that, there it is, here it comes," said Serpukhowsky, laughing. "Ever since I heard about you, about your refusal, I began, of course I approved of what you did, but there are ways of doing everything, and I think your action was good in itself, but you didn't do it quite in the way you ought to have done. What's done can't be undone, and you know, I I never go back on what I've done, and besides I'm very well off for a time. But you're not satisfied with that. I wouldn't say this to your brother. He's a nice child like our host here. There he goes, he added, listening to the roar of hurrah. And he's happy. But that does not satisfy you. I didn't say it did satisfy me, yes. But that's not the only thing. Such men as you are wanted by whom? By society, by Russia. Russia needs men, she needs a party, or else everything goes and will go to the dogs. How do you mean Bartanov's party against the Russian communists? No, said Sepakovsky, frowning with vexation at being suspected of such an absurdity. Tusa, at UN blog, it's always been and always will be. There are no communists, but intriguing people have to invent a noxious, dangerous party. It's an old trick. No, what's wanted is a powerful party of independent men like you and me. But why so? Bronsky mentioned a few men who were in power. Why aren't they independent men? Simply because they have not or have not had from birth an independent fortune. They have not a name. They've not been close to the sun and centers we have. They can be bought either by money or by favor, and they've had to find support for themselves in inventing a policy. And they bring forward some notion, some policy that they don't believe in, that does harm, and the whole policy is really only a means to a government house and so much income. Ce La ni pap plufang kuzo. When you get a peep at their cards, I may be inferior to them, stupider perhaps, though I don't see why I should be inferior to them. But you and I have one important advantage over them for certain in being more difficult to buy, and such men are more needed than ever. Bronsky listened attentively, but he was not so much interested in the meaning of the words as by the attitude of Sergei Pavtsov, who was already contemplating a struggle with the existing powers and already had his likes and dislikes in that higher world, while his own interest in the governing world did not go beyond the interests of his regiment. Vronsky felt how powerful Sapkovsky might become through his unmistakable faculty for thinking things out and for taking things in, through his intelligence and gift of words so rarely met in the world in which he moved, and ashamed as he was of the feeling he felt, envious still. I haven't the one thing of most importance for that, he answered. I haven't the desire for power. I had it once, but it's gone. Excuse me, that's not true, said Sapkovsky, smiling. Yes, it is true. It is true now, Vronsky added, to be truthful. Yes, it's true now. That's another thing. But that now won't last forever, perhaps, answered Vronsky. You say perhaps, Sir Pavtsov went on, as though guessing his thoughts. But I say for certain. And that's what I wanted to see you for. Your action was just what it should have been. I see that, but you ought not to keep it up. I only ask you to give me carte blanche. I'm not going to offer you my protection, though indeed, why shouldn't I protect you? You've protected me often enough. I should hope our friendship rises above all that sort of thing. Yes, he said, smiling to him as tenderly as a woman. Give me carte blanche, retire from the regiment, and I'll draw you upwards imperceptibly. But you must understand that I want nothing, said Vronsky, except that all should be as it is. Sapkovsky got up and stood facing him. You say that all should be as it is. I understand what that means. But listen, we're the same age. You've known a greater number of women perhaps than I have. Sapkovsky's smile and gestures told Vronsky that he mustn't be afraid, that he would be tender and careful in touching the sore place. But I'm married, and believe me, and getting to know thoroughly one's wife, if one loves her, as someone has said, one gets to know all women better than if one knew thousands of them. We're coming directly, Vronsky shouted to an officer who looked into the room and called them to the colonel. Vronsky was longing now to hear to the end and know what Serpukhowsky would say to him. And here's my opinion for you. Women are the chief stumbling block in a man's career. It's hard to love a woman and do anything. There's only one way of having love conveniently, without its being a hindrance. That's marriage. How am I to tell you what I mean, said Sapkovsky, who liked similes. Wait a minute, yes, just as you can only carry a fardeau and do something with your hands when the fardeau is tied on your back. And that's marriage. And that's what I felt when I was married. My hands were suddenly set free. But to drag that fardeau about with you, without marriage, your hands will always be so full that you can do nothing. Look at Mazankov and Krupov. They've ruined their careers for the sake of women. What women, said Vronsky, recalling the French woman and the actress with whom the two men he had mentioned were connected. The firmer the woman's footing in society, the worse it is. It's much the same as not merely carrying the fardo in your arms but tearing it away from someone else you have never loved," Vronsky said softly, looking straight before him and thinking of Anna perhaps. "But remember what I've said to you, and another thing, women are all more materialistic than men. We make something immense out of love, but they are always terra directly," he cried to a footman who came in. But the footman had not come to call them again, as he supposed. The footman brought Vronsky a note. A man brought it from Princess Furskaya. Vronsky opened the letter and flushed crimson. "My head's begun to ache. I'm going home," he said to Sapkovsky. "Oh, goodbye, then you give me carte blanche. We'll talk about it later on. I'll look you up in Petersburg." Chapter 22. It was 6 o'clock already, and so, in order to be there quickly, and at the same time not to drive with his own horses known to everyone, Vronsky got into Yajvin's hired fly and told the driver to drive as quickly as possible. It was a roomy old-fashioned fly with seats for four. He sat in one corner, stretched his legs out on the front seat, and sank into meditation, a vague sense of the order into which his affairs had been brought, a vague recollection of the friendliness and flattery of Sir Pukovsky, who had considered him a man that was needed, and most of all the anticipation of the interview before him, all blended into a general joyous sense of life. This feeling was so strong that he could not help smiling. He dropped his legs, crossed one leg over the other knee, and taking it in his hand, felt the springy muscle of the calf where it had been grazed the day before by his fall, and leaning back he drew several deep breaths. "I'm happy, very happy," he said to himself. He had often before had this sense of physical joy in his own body, but he had never felt so fond of himself, of his own body, as at that moment. He enjoyed the slight ache in his strong leg. He enjoyed the muscular sensation of movement in his chest as he breathed the bright cold August day, which had made Anna feel so hopeless, seemed to him keenly stimulating, and refreshed his face and neck that still tingled from the cold water. The scent of brilliancy on his whiskers struck him as particularly pleasant in the fresh air. Everything he saw from the carriage window, everything in that cold pure air in the pale light of the sunset, was as fresh and gay and strong as he was himself. The roofs of the houses shining in the rays of the setting sun, the sharp outlines of fences and angles of buildings, the figures of passers-by, the carriages that met him now, and then the motionless green of the trees and grass, the fields with evenly drawn furrows of potatoes, and the slanting shadows that fell from the houses and trees and bushes, and even from the rows of potatoes. Everything was bright, like a pretty landscape just finished and freshly varnished. "Get on," he said to the driver, putting his head out of the window and pulling a 3-ruble note out of his pocket. He handed it to the driver. As he looked round, the driver's hand fumbled with something at the lamp. The whip cracked, and the carriage rolled rapidly along the smooth high road. "I want nothing but this happiness," he thought, staring at the bone button of the bell and the space between the windows, and picturing to himself Anna just as he had seen her last time. "And as I go on, I love her more and more. Here's the garden of the Varade villa. Whereabouts will she be? Where? How? Why did she fix on this place to meet me? And why did she write in Betsy's letter?" he thought, wondering now for the first time at it. But there was now no time for wonder. He called to the driver to stop before reaching the avenue, and opening the door, jumped out of the carriage as it was moving and went into the avenue that led up to the house. There was no one in the avenue, but looking round to the right he caught sight of her. Her face was hidden by a veil, but he drank in with glad eyes the special movement in walking particular to her alone, the slope of the shoulders, the setting of the head, and at once a sort of electric shock ran all over him. With fresh force he felt conscious of himself, from the springy motions of his legs to the movements of his lungs as he breathed, and something set his lips twitching. Joining him, she pressed his hand tightly. "You're not angry that I sent for you? I absolutely had to see you," she said, and the serious and set line of her lips, which he saw under the veil, transformed his mood at once. "I angry? But how have you come? Where from?" "Never mind," she said, laying her hand on his. "Come along, I must talk to you." He saw that something had happened, and that the interview would not be a joyous one in her presence. He had no will of his own. Without knowing the grounds of her distress, he already felt the same distress unconsciously passing over him. "What is it?" would he asked her, squeezing her hand with his elbow and trying to read her thoughts in her face, she walked on a few steps in silence, gathering her courage. Then suddenly she stopped. "I did not tell you yesterday," she began, breathing quickly and painfully, "that coming home with Alexei Alexandrovich, I told him everything, told him I could not be his wife, that, and told him everything." He heard her unconsciously bending his whole figure down to her, as though hoping in this way to soften the hardness of her position for her. But directly she had said this, he suddenly drew himself up, and a proud and hard expression came over his face. "Yes, yes, that's better, 1,000 times better. I know how painful it was," he said. But she was not listening to his words. She was reading his thoughts. From the expression of his face, she could not guess that that expression arose from the first idea that presented itself to Vronsky, that a duel was now inevitable. The idea of a duel had never crossed her mind, and so she put a different interpretation on this passing expression of hardness. When she got her husband's letter, she knew then at the bottom of her heart that everything would go on in the old way, that she would not have the strength of will to forego her position, to abandon her son, and to join her lover. The morning spent at Princess Tverskaya's had confirmed her still more in this, but this interview was still of the utmost gravity for her. She hoped that this interview would transform her position and save her if, on hearing this news, he were to say to her resolutely, passionately, without an instant's wavering, "Throw up everything and come with me," she would give up her son and go away with him. But this news had not produced what she had expected in him. He simply seemed as though he were resenting some affront. "It was not in the least painful to me. It happened of itself," she said irritably. "And see," she pulled her husband's letter out of her glove. I understand," he interrupted her, taking the letter, but not reading it, and trying to soothe her. "The one thing I longed for, the one thing I prayed for, was to cut short this position so as to devote my life to your happiness. Why do you tell me that?" she said. "Do you suppose I can doubt it? If I doubted, who's that coming?" said Vronsky, suddenly pointing to two ladies walking towards them. "Perhaps they know us," and he hurriedly turned off, drawing her after him into a side path. "Oh, I don't care," she said. Her lips were quivering, and he fancied that her eyes looked with strange fury at him from under the veil. "I tell you, that's not the point. I can't doubt that, but see what he writes to me. Read it." She stood still again, just as at the first moment of hearing of her rupture with her husband. Vronsky, on reading the letter, was unconsciously carried away by the natural sensation aroused in him by his own relation to the betrayed husband. Now, while he held his letter in his hands, he could not help picturing the challenge which he would most likely find at home today or tomorrow, and the duel itself, in which, with the same cold and haughty expression that his face was assuming at this moment, he would await the injured husband's shot, after having himself fired into the air. And at that instant there flashed across his mind the thought of what Serpukhov just said to him, and what he had himself been thinking in the morning, that it was better not to bind himself. And he knew that this thought he could not tell her. Having read the letter, he raised his eyes to her, and there was no determination in them. She saw at once that he had been thinking about it before by himself. She knew that whatever he might say to her, he would not say all he thought, and she knew that her last hope had failed her. This was not what she had been reckoning on. "You see the sort of man he is," she said with a shaking voice. "He forgive me, but I rejoice at it," Vronsky interrupted. "For God's sake, let me finish," he added, his eyes imploring her to give him the time to explain his words. "I rejoice because things cannot possibly remain as he supposes." "Why can't they?" Anna said, restraining her tears and obviously attaching no sort of consequence to what he said. She felt that her fate was sealed. Vronsky meant that after the duel inevitable, he thought, things could not go on as before. But he said something different. "It can't go on. I hope that now you will leave him. I hope," he was confused and reddened, "that you will let me arrange and plan our life tomorrow." He was beginning. She did not let him go on. "But my child," she shrieked, "you see what he writes. I should have to leave him, and I can't and won't do that. But for God's sake, which is better, leave your child or keep up this degrading position." "To whom is it degrading? To all, and most of all to you." "You say degrading. Don't say that. Those words have no meaning for me," she said in a shaking voice. She did not want him now to say what was untrue. She had nothing left her but his love, and she wanted to love him. Don't you understand that from the day I loved you, everything has changed for me. There's one thing and one thing only, your love. If that's mine, I feel so exalted, so strong that nothing can be humiliating to me. I'm proud of my position. Because proud of being proud, she could not say what she was proud of. Tears of shame and despair choked her utterance. She stood still and sobbed. He felt something swelling in his throat and twitching in his nose, and for the first time in his life he felt on the point of weeping. He could not have said exactly what it was touched him. So he felt sorry for her, and he felt he could not help her, and with that he knew that he was to blame for her wretchedness, and that he had done something wrong. Is not a divorce possible? He said feebly. She shook her head, not answering. Couldn't you take your son and still leave him? Yes, but it all depends on him now. I must go to him, she said shortly. Her presentiment that all would again go on in the old way had not deceived her. On Tuesday, I shall be in Petersburg and everything can be settled. Yes, she said, but don't let us talk any more of it. On his carriage, which she had sent away and ordered to come back to the little gate of the Veda garden, drove up. Anna said goodbye to Vronsky and drove home. Chapter 23. On Monday, there was the usual sitting of the commission of June 2nd. Alexei Alexandrovich walked into the hall where the sitting was held, greeted the members and the president as usual, and sat down in his place, putting his hand on the papers laid ready before him. Among these papers lay the necessary evidence and a rough outline of the speech he intended to make, but he did not really need these documents. He remembered every point and did not think it necessary to go over in his memory what he would say. He knew that when the time came, and when he saw his enemy facing him and studiously endeavoring to assume an expression of indifference, his speech would flow of itself better than he could prepare it. Now he felt that the import of his speech was of such magnitude that every word of it would have weight. Meantime, as he listened to the usual report, he had the most innocent and inoffensive air. No one looking at his white hands with their swollen veins and long fingers so softly stroking the edges of the white paper that lay before him, and at the air of weariness with which his head drooped on one side, would have suspected that in a few minutes a torrent of words would flow from his lips that would arouse a fearful storm, set the members shouting and attacking one another, and force the president to call for order. When the report was over, Alexei Alexandrovich announced in his subdued, delicate voice that he had several points to bring before the meeting in regard to the reorganization of the native tribes. All attention was turned to him. Alexei Alexandrovich cleared his throat, and not looking at his opponent, but selecting as he always did while he was delivering his speeches the first person sitting opposite him, an inoffensive little old man who never had an opinion of any sort. In the commission began to expound his views. When he reached the point about the fundamental and radical law, his opponent jumped up and began to protest. Stremov, who was also a member of the commission and also stung to the quick, began defending himself, and altogether a stormy sitting followed. But Alexei Alexandrovich triumphed, and his motion was carried. 3 new commissions were appointed, and the next day in a certain Petersburg circle nothing else was talked of but the sitting. Alexei Alexandrovich's success had been even greater than he had anticipated. Next morning, Tuesday, Alexei Alexandrovich, on waking up, recollected with pleasure his triumph of the previous day, and he could not help smiling, though he tried to appear indifferent when the chief secretary of his department, anxious to flatter him, informed him of the rumors that had reached him concerning what had happened in the commission. Absorbed in business with the chief secretary, Alexei Alexandrovich had completely forgotten that it was Tuesday, the day fixed by him for the return of Anna Arkadyevna, and he was surprised and received a shock of annoyance when a servant came to inform him of her arrival. Anna had arrived in Petersburg early in the morning. The carriage had been sent to meet her in accordance with her telegram, and so Alexei Alexandrovich might have known of her arrival. But when she arrived, he did not meet her. She was told that he had not yet gone out, but was busy with his secretary. She sent word to her husband that she had come, went to her own room, and occupied herself in sorting out her things, expecting he would come to her. But an hour passed. He did not come. She went into the dining room on the pretext of giving some directions, and spoke loudly on purpose, expecting him to come out there. But he did not come, Though she heard him go to the door of his study as he parted from the chief secretary, she knew that he usually went out quickly to his office, and she wanted to see him before that. So that their attitude to one another might be defined, she walked across the drawing room and went resolutely to him when she went into his study he was in. Official uniform, obviously ready to go out, sitting at a little table on which he rested his elbows, looking dejectedly before him. She saw him before he saw her, and she saw that he was thinking of her. On seeing her, he would have risen, but changed his mind. Then his face flushed hotly, a thing Anna had never seen before, and he got up quickly and went to meet her, looking not at her eyes, but above them at her forehead and hair. He went up to her, took her by the hand, and asked her to sit down. "I am very glad you have come," he said, sitting down beside her, and obviously wishing to say something. He stuttered several times. He began to speak, but stopped in spite of the fact that, preparing herself for meeting him, she had schooled herself to despise and reproach him. She did not know what to say to him, and she felt sorry for him, and so the silence lasted for some time. "Is Seriosha quite well?" he said, and not waiting for an answer, he added, "I shan't be dining at home today, and I have got to go out directly. I had thought of going to Moscow." She said, "No, you did quite right to come," he said, and was silent again. Seeing that he was powerless to begin the conversation, she began herself. "Alexei Alexandrovich," she said, looking at him and not dropping her eyes under his persistent gaze at her hair, "I'm a guilty woman. I'm a bad woman, but I am the same as I was, as I told you then, and I have come to tell you that I can change nothing. I have asked you no question about that," he said all at once, resolutely and with hatred, looking her straight in the face. "That was as I had supposed." Under the influence of anger, he apparently regained complete possession of all his faculties. "But as I told you then, and have written to you," he said in a thin, shrill voice, "I repeat now that I am not bound to know this. I ignore it. Not all wives are so kind as you to be in such a hurry to communicate such agreeable news to their husbands." He lays special emphasis on the word agreeable. "I shall ignore it so long as the world knows nothing of it, so long as my name is not disgraced. And so I simply inform you that our relations must be just as they have always been, and that only in the event of your compromising me shall I be obliged to take steps to secure my honor. But our relations cannot be the same as always." Anna began in a timid voice, looking at him with dismay when she saw once more those composed gestures, heard that shrill, childish, and sarcastic voice. Her aversion for him extinguished her pity for him, and she felt only afraid. But at all costs she wanted to make clear her position. "I cannot be your wife while I—" she began. He laughed, a cold and malignant laugh, the manner of life you have chosen is reflected, I suppose, in your ideas. I have too much respect or contempt, or both. I respect your past and despise your present, that I was far from the interpretation you put on my words." Anna sighed and bowed her head. "Though indeed I fail to comprehend how, with the independence you show," he went on, getting hot, "announcing your infidelity to your husband, and seeing nothing reprehensible in it. Apparently you can see anything reprehensible in performing a wife's duties in relation to your husband." "Alexei Alexandrovich, what is it you want of me?" "I want you not to meet that man here, and to conduct yourself so that neither the world nor the servants can reproach you. Not to see him, that's not much, I think, and in return you will enjoy all the privileges of a faithful wife without fulfilling her duties. That's all I have to say to you. Now it's time for me to go. I'm not dining at home." He got up and moved towards the door. Anna got up to bowing in silence. He let her pass before him. Chapter 24. The night spent by Levin on the haycock did not pass without result for him. The way in which he had been managing his land revolted him, and had lost all attraction for him. In spite of the magnificent harvest, never had there been, or at least never, it seemed to him, had there been so many hindrances and so many quarrels between him and the peasants as that year, and the origin of these failures and this hostility was now perfectly comprehensible to him. The delight he had experienced in the work itself, and the consequent greater intimacy with the peasants, the envy he felt of them, of their life, the desire to adopt that life which had been to him that night not a dream, but an intention, the execution of which he had thought out in detail. All this had so transformed his view of the farming of the land as he had managed it, that he could not take his former interest in it and could not help seeing that unpleasant relation between him and the work people, which was the foundation of it all. The herd of improved cows such as Pava, the whole land plowed over and enriched the 9-level. Fields surrounded with hedges, the 240 acres heavily manured, the seeds sown and drills. And all the rest of it, it was all splendid if only the work had been done for themselves or for themselves and comrades, people in sympathy with them. But he saw clearly now his work on a book of agriculture, in which the chief element in husbandry was to have been the laborer, greatly assisted him in this, that the sort of farming he was carrying on was nothing but a cruel and stubborn struggle between him and the laborers, in which there was on one side his side a continual intense effort to change everything to a pattern he considered better, on the other side the natural order of things, and in this struggle he saw that with immense expenditure of force on his side, and with no effort or even intention on the other side, all that was attained was that the work did not go to the liking of either side, and that splendid tools, splendid cattle and land were spoiled with no good to anyone. Worst of all, the energy expended on this work was not simply wasted. He could not help feeling now, since the meaning of his system had become clear to him, that the aim of his energy was a most unworthy one. In reality, what was the struggle about? He was struggling for every farthing of his share, and he could not help it, for he had only to relax his efforts, and he would not have had the money to pay his laborers' wages, while they were only struggling to be able to do their work easily and agreeably, that is to say, as they were used to doing it. It was for his interest that every laborer should work as hard as possible, and that while doing so he should keep his wits about him, so as to try not to break the winnowing machines, the horse rakes, the threshing machines, that he should attend to what he was doing. What the laborer wanted was to work as pleasantly as possible, with rests, and above all carelessly and heedlessly, without thinking. That summer Levin saw this at every step. He sent the men to mow some clover for hay, picking out the worst patches where the clover was overgrown with grass and weeds and of no use for seed. Again and again they mowed the best acres of clover, justifying themselves by the pretense that the bailiff had told them to, and trying to pacify him with the assurance that it would be splendid hay. But he knew that it was owing to these acres being so much easier to mow. He sent out a hay machine for pitching the hay. It was broken at the first row, because it was dull work for a peasant to sit on the seat in front with the great wings waving above him. And he was told, "Don't trouble, your honor, sure the women folks will pitch it quick enough." The plows were practically useless, because it never occurred to the laborer to raise the share when he turned the plow, and forcing it round he strained the horses and tore up the ground. And Levin was begged not to mind about it. The horses were allowed to stray into the wheat, because not a single laborer would consent to be night watchman, and in spite of orders to the contrary, the laborers insisted on taking turns for night duty. And even after working all day long fell asleep, and was very penitent for his fault, saying, "Do what you will to me, your honor." They killed 3 of the best calves by letting them into the clover aftermath without care as to their drinking, and nothing would make the men believe that they had been blown out by the clover. But they told him by way of consolation that one of his neighbors had lost 112 head of cattle in 3 days. All this happened not because anyone felt ill will to Levin or his farm. On the contrary, he knew that they liked him, thought him a simple gentleman, their highest praise. But it happened simply because all they wanted was to work merrily and carelessly, and his interests were not only remote and incomprehensible to them, but fatally opposed to their most just claims. Long before Levin had felt dissatisfaction with his own position in regard to the land. He saw where his boat leaked, but he did not look for the leak. Perhaps purposely deceiving himself, nothing would be left him if he lost faith in it. But now he could deceive himself no longer. The farming of the land as he was managing it had become not merely unattractive, but revolting to him, and he could take no further interest in it. To this now was joined the presence, only 25 miles off of Kitty Sherbtsovaya, whom he longed to see and could not see. Daria Alexandrovna Oblanskaya had invited him when he was over there to come with the object of renewing his offer to her sister, who would, so she gave him to understand, accept him. Now Levin himself had felt on seeing Kitty Shrabtsova that he had never ceased to love her, but he could not go over to the Oblonsky's knowing she was there. The fact that he had made her an offer and she had refused him had placed an insuperable barrier between her and him. I can't ask her to be my wife merely because she can't be the wife of the man she wanted to marry, he said to himself. The thought of this made him cold and hostile to her. I should not be able to speak to her without a feeling of reproach. I could not look at her without resentment, and she will only hate me all the more as she's bound to. And besides, how can I now, after what Darya Alexandrovna told me, go to see them? Can I help showing that I know what she told me, and me to go magnanimously to forgive her and have pity on her? Me go through a performance before her of forgiving and deigning to bestow my love on her. What induced Darya Alexandrovna to tell me that by chance I might have seen her? Then everything would have happened of itself. But as it is, it's out of the question, out of the question. Darya Alexandrovna sent him a letter asking him for a side saddle for Kitty's use. I'm told you have a nice side saddle. She wrote to him, I hope you'll bring it over yourself. This was more than he could stand. How could a woman of any intelligence, of any delicacy, put her sister in such a humiliating position? He wrote 10 notes and tore them all up and sent the saddle without any reply. To write that he would go was impossible because he could not go. To write that he could not come because something prevented him, or that he would be away, that was still worse. He sent the saddle without an answer and with a sense of having done something shameful. He handed over all the now revolting business of the estate to the bailiff and set off next day to a remote district to see his friend Svyazhky, who had splendid marshes for grouse in his neighborhood and had lately written to ask him to keep a long-standing promise to stay with him. The grouse marsh in the Surovsky district had long tempted Levin, but he had continually put off his visit on account of his work on the estate. Now he was glad to get away from the neighborhood of the Sharbetskys, and still more from his farm work, especially on a shooting expedition, which always, in trouble, served as the best consolation. Chapter 25. In the Surovsky district, there was no railway nor service of post horses, and Levin drove there with his own horses in his big old-fashioned carriage. He stopped halfway at a well to do peasants to feed his horses. A bald, well-preserved old man with a broad red beard gray on his cheeks opened the gate, squeezing against the gate post to let the 3 horses pass, directing the coachman to a place under the shed in the big, clean, tidy yard with charred old-fashioned plows in it. The old man asked Levin to come into the parlor. A cleanly dressed young woman with clogs on her bare feet was scrubbing the floor in the new outer room. She was frightened of the dog that ran in after Levin and uttered a shriek, but began laughing at her own fright at once. When she was told the dog would not hurt her, pointing Levin with her bare arm to the door into the parlor, she bent down again, hiding her handsome face, and went on scrubbing. Would you like the samovar? She asked. Yes, please. The parlor was a big room with a Dutch stove and a screen dividing it into 2. Under the holy pictures stood a table painted in patterns. A bench and 2 chairs near the entrance was a dresser full of crockery. The shutters were closed. There were few flies, and it was so clean that Levin was anxious that Laska, who had been running along the road and bathing in puddles, should not muddy the floor, and ordered her to a place in the corner by the door. After looking around the parlor, Levin went out in the backyard. The good-looking young woman in clogs, swinging the empty pails on the yoke, ran on before him to the well for water. Look sharp, my girl, the old man shouted after her good-humoredly, and he went up to Levin. Well, sir, are you going to Nikolai Ivanovich Fyodorov's? His honor comes to us too. He began chatting, leaning his elbows on the railing of the steps. In the middle of the old man's account of his acquaintance with Shepkovsky, the gates creaked again, and laborers came into the yard from the fields with wooden plows and harrows. The horses harnessed to the plows and harrows were sleek and fat. The laborers were obviously of the household. 2 were young men in cotton shirts and caps. The 2 others were hired laborers in homespun shirts, one an old man, the other a young fellow. Moving off from the steps, the old man went up to the horses and began unharnessing them. What have they been plowing? Asked Levin. Plowing up the potatoes. We rent a bit of land to Fido. Don't let out the gelding, but take it to the trough, and we'll put the other in harness. Oh, "Father, the plowshares," I ordered. As he brought them along, asked the big healthy-looking fellow, obviously the old man's son there in the outer room, answered the old man, bundling together the harness he'd taken off and flinging it. "On the ground, you can put them on while they have dinner." The good-looking young woman came into the outer room. With the full pails dragging at her shoulders, more women came on the scene, from somewhere young and handsome, middle-aged, old and ugly. With children and without children, the samovar was beginning to sing the laborers, and the family, having disposed of the horses, came in to dinner. Levin, getting his provisions out of his carriage, invited the old man to take tea with him. "Well, I've had some today already," said the old man, obviously accepting the invitation with pleasure. "But just a glass for company over their tea." Levin heard all about the old man's farming. 10 years before, the old man had rented 300 acres from the lady who owned them, and a year ago he'd bought them and rented another 300 from a neighboring landowner. A small part of the land, the worst part, he let out for rent, while 100 acres of arable land he cultivated himself with his family and to hired laborers. The old man complained that things were doing badly, but Levin saw that he simply did so from a feeling of propriety, and that his farm was in a flourishing condition. If it had been unsuccessful, he would not have bought land at 35 rubles the acre. He would not have married his 3 sons and a nephew. He would not have rebuilt twice after fires, and each time on a larger scale. In spite of the old man's complaints, it was evident that he was proud, and justly proud, of his prosperity, proud of his sons, his nephew, his sons' wives, his horses, and his cows, and especially of the fact that he was keeping all this farming going. From this conversation with the old man, Levin thought he was not averse to new methods either. He'd planted a great many potatoes, and his potatoes, as Levin had seen driving past, were already past flowering and beginning to die down, while Levin's were only just coming into flower. He earthed up his potatoes with a modern plow borrowed from a neighboring landowner. He sowed wheat. The trifling fact that thinning out his rye, the old man used the rye he thinned out for his horses, especially struck Levin. How many times had Levin seen this splendid fodder wasted and tried to get it saved, but always it had turned out to be impossible. The peasant got this done, and he could not say enough in praise of it as food for the beasts. What have the wenches to do? They carry it out in bundles to the roadside, and the cart brings it away. Well, we landowners can't manage well with our laborers, said Levin, handing him a glass of tea. "Thank you," said the old man, and he took the glass, but refused sugar, pointing to a lump he had left. "There's simple destruction," he said. "Look at Svobodsky's, for instance. We know what the land's like, first rate, yet there's not much of a crop to boast of. It's not looked after enough, that's all it is. But you work your land with hired laborers. We're all peasants together. We go into everything ourselves. If a man's no use, he can go, and we can manage by ourselves." "Father Finnegan wants some tar," said the young woman in the clogs, coming in. "Yes, yes, that's how it is," said the old man. Getting up and crossing himself deliberately, he thanked Levin and went out. When Levin went into the kitchen to call his coachman, he saw the whole family at dinner. The women were standing up waiting on them. The young sturdy-looking son was telling something funny with his mouth full of pudding, and they were all laughing. The woman in the clogs, who was pouring cabbage soup into a bowl, laughing most merrily of all, very probably the good-looking face of the young woman in the clogs had a good deal to do with the impression of well-being this peasant household made upon Levin. But the impression was so strong that Levin could never get rid of it, and all the way from the old peasants to Sviatsky's, he kept recalling this peasant farm, as though there was something in this impression that demanded special attention. Chapter 26. Sviatovsky was the marshal of his district. He was 5 years older than Levin, and had long been married. His sister-in-law, young girl Levin liked very much, lived in his house, and Levin knew that Sviatovsky and his wife would have greatly liked to marry the girl to him. He knew this with certainty, as so-called eligible young men always know it, though he could never have brought himself to speak of it to anyone. And he knew to that, although he wanted to get married, and although by every token this very attractive girl would make an excellent wife, he could no more have married her even if he had not been in love with Kitty Sherbatskaya than he could have flown up to the sky and this knowledge poisoned the pleasure he had hoped to find in the visit to Sviazhsky. On getting Sviazhsky's letter with the invitation for shooting, Levin had immediately thought of this. But in spite of it, he'd made up his mind that Sviazhsky's having such views for him was simply his own groundless supposition, and so he would go all the same. Besides, at the bottom of his heart he had a desire to try himself, put himself to the test in regard to this girl. The Sviazhsky's home life was exceedingly pleasant, and Sviazhsky himself the best type of man, taking part in local affairs that Levin knew and was very interesting to him. Sviazhsky was one of those people, always a source of wonder to Levin, whose convictions, very logical though never original, go one way by themselves, while their life, exceedingly definite and firm in its direction, goes its way quite apart and almost always in direct contradiction to their convictions. Sviazhsky was an extremely advanced man. He despised the nobility and believed the mass of the nobility to be secretly in favor of serfdom and only concealing their views from cowardice. He regarded Russia as a ruined country, rather after the style of Turkey, and the government of Russia is so bad that he never permitted himself to criticize its doings seriously, and yet he was a functionary of that government and a model marshal of nobility, and when he drove about he always wore the cockade of office and the cap with the red band. He considered human life only tolerable abroad and went abroad to stay at every opportunity, and at the same time he carried on a complex and improved system of agriculture in Russia, and with extreme interest followed everything and knew everything that was being done in Russia. He considered the Russian peasant as occupying a stage of development intermediate between the ape and the man, and at the same time in the local assemblies no one was readier to shake hands with the peasants and listen to their opinion. He believed neither in God nor the devil, but was much concerned about the question of the improvement of the clergy and the maintenance of their revenues, and took special trouble to keep up the church in his village. On the woman question, he was on the side of the extreme advocates of complete liberty for women and especially their right to labor, but he lived with his wife on such terms that their affectionate childless home life was the admiration of everyone, and arranged his wife's life so that she did nothing and could do nothing but share her husband's efforts, that her time should pass as happily and as agreeably as possible. If it had not been a characteristic of Levin's to put the most favorable interpretation on people, Sviazhsky's character would have presented no doubt or difficulty to him. He would have said to himself a fool or a knave, and everything would have seemed clear. But he could not say a fool, because Sviazhsky was unmistakably clever and moreover a highly cultivated man who was exceptionally modest over his culture. There was not a subject he knew nothing of, but he did not display his knowledge except when he was compelled to do so. Still less could Levin say that he was a knave, as Sviazhsky was unmistakably an honest, good-hearted, sensible man who worked good-humoredly, keenly, and perseveringly at his work. He was held in high honor by everyone about him, and certainly he had never consciously done, and was indeed incapable of doing, anything base. Levin tried to understand him and could not understand him, and looked at him as at a living enigma. Levin and he were very friendly, and so Levin used to venture to sound Fyodor Fyodorovich to try to get at the very foundation of his view of life, but it was always in vain. Every time Levin tried to penetrate beyond the outer chambers of Sviazhsky's mind, which were hospitality open to all, he noticed that Sviazhsky was slightly disconcerted. Faint signs of alarm were visible in his eyes, as though he were afraid Levin would understand him, and he would give him a kindly, good-humored repulse. Just now, since his disenchantment with farming, Levin was particularly glad to stay with Sviazhsky, apart from the fact that the sight of this happy and affectionate couple, so pleased with themselves and everyone else, and their well-ordered home, had always a cheering effect on Levin. He felt a longing, now that he was so dissatisfied with his own life, to get at the secret in Sviazhsky that gave him such clearness, definiteness, and good courage in life. Moreover, Levin knew that at Sviazhsky's he should meet the landowners of the neighborhood, and it was particularly interesting for him just now to hear and take part in those rural conversations concerning crops, laborers' wages, and so on, which he was aware are conventionally regarded as something very low, but which seemed to him just now to constitute the one subject of importance it was not perhaps of importance in the days of serfdom, and it may not be of importance in England. In both cases the conditions of agriculture are firmly established, but among us now, when everything has been turned upside down and is only just taking shape, the question, what form these conditions will take, is the one question of importance. In Russia, thought Levin, the shooting turned out to be worse than Levin had expected. The marsh was dry, and there were no grouse at all. He walked about the whole day and only brought back 3 birds, but to make up for that he brought back, as he always did, from shooting, an excellent appetite, excellent spirits, and that keen intellectual mood which with him always accompanied violent physical exertion. And while out shooting, when he seemed to be thinking of nothing at all, suddenly the old man and his family kept coming back to his mind, and the impression of them seemed to claim not merely his attention, but the solution of some question connected with them. In the evening at tea, 2 landowners who had come about some business connected with a wardship were of the party, and the interesting conversation Levin had been looking forward to sprang up. Levin was sitting beside his hostess at the tea table and was obliged to keep up a conversation with her and her sister, who was sitting opposite him. Madame Chavitsky was a round-faced, fair-haired, rather short woman, all smiles and dimples. Levin tried through her to get a solution of the weighty enigma her husband presented to his mind, but he had not complete freedom of ideas, because he was in an agony of embarrassment. This agony of embarrassment was due to the fact that the sister-in-law was sitting opposite to him in a dress especially put on, as he fancied, for his benefit, cut particularly open in the shape of a trapeze on her white bosom. This quadrangular opening, in spite of the bosom's being very white, or just because it was very white, deprived Levin of the full use of his faculties. He imagined, probably mistakenly, that this low-necked bodice had been made on his account, and felt that he had no right to look at it, and tried not to look at it, but he felt that he was to blame for the very fact of the low-necked bodice having been made. It seemed to Levin that he had deceived someone, that he ought to explain something, but that to explain it was impossible, and for that reason he was continually blushing, was ill at ease and awkward. His awkwardness infected the pretty sister-in-law too, but their hostess appeared not to observe this and kept purposely drawing her into the conversation. "You say," she said, pursuing the subject that had been started, "that my husband cannot be interested in what's Russian. It's quite the contrary. He's always in cheerful spirits abroad, but not as he is here. Here he feels in his proper place. He has so much to do, and he has the faculty of interesting himself in everything. Oh, you've not been to see our school, have you? I've seen it, the little house covered with ivy, isn't it? Yes, that's nasty as work," she said, indicating her sister. "You teach in it yourself?" asked Levin, trying to look above the open neck, but feeling that wherever he looked in that direction, he should see it. "Yes, I used to teach in it myself, and do teach still. But we have a first-rate school mistress now, and we've started gymnastic exercises." "No thank you, I won't have any more tea," said Levin, and conscious of doing a rude thing, but incapable of continuing the conversation, he got up, blushing. "I hear a very interesting conversation," he added, and walked to the other end of the table where Sviatsky was sitting with the 2 gentlemen of the neighborhood. Sviatsky was sitting sideways, with one elbow on the table and a cup in one hand, while with the other hand he gathered up his beard, held it to his nose, and let it drop again, as though he was smelling it. His brilliant black eyes were looking straight at the excited country gentleman with gray whiskers, and apparently he derived amusement from his remarks. The gentleman was complaining of the peasants. It was evident to Levin that Sviatsky knew an answer to this gentleman's complaints, which would at once demolish his whole contention, but that in his position he could not give utterance to this answer, and listened not without pleasure to the landowner's comic speeches. The gentleman with the gray whiskers was obviously an inveterate adherent of serfdom, and a devoted agriculturalist who had lived all his life in the country. Levin saw proofs of this in his dress, in the old-fashioned threadbare coat, obviously not his everyday attire, in his shrewd, deep-set eyes, in his idiomatic, fluent Russian, in the imperious tone that had become habitual from long use, and in the resolute gestures of his large red sunburned hands with an old betrothal ring. On the little finger, chapter 27, if I'd only the heart to throw up what's been set going, such a lot of trouble wasted, I'd turn my back on the whole business, sell up, go off like Nikolai Ivanov to hear L.A. Belle Helene, said the landowner, a pleasant smile lighting up his shrewd old face. But you see, you don't throw it up, said Nikolai Ivanovich Fyodorovsky. So there must be something gained. The only gain is that I live in my own house, neither bought nor hired. Besides, one keeps hoping the people will learn sense, though instead of that, you'd never believe it, the drunkenness, the immorality, they keep chopping and changing their bits of land, not a sight of a horse or a cow, the peasants dying of hunger. But just go and take him on as a laborer. He'll do his best to do you a mischief and then bring you up before the justice of the peace. But then you make complaints to the justice, to said Svavsky. I lodge complaints not for anything in the world, such a talking and such a to-do, that one would have cause to regret it. At the works, for instance, they pocketed the advance money and made off. What did the justice do? Why, he acquitted them. Nothing keeps them in order but their own communal court and their village elder. He'll flog them in the good old style, but for that there'd be nothing for it but to give it all up and run away. Obviously, the landowner was chaffing Sviovsky, who, far from resenting it, was apparently amused by it. But you see, we manage our land without such extreme measures, said he, smiling. Levin and I, and this gentleman, he indicated the landowner. Yes, the thing's done at Mikhail Petrovich's, but ask him how it's done. Do you call that a rational system? Said the landowner, obviously proud of the word rational. My system's very simple, said Mikhail Petrovich. Thank God, all my management rests on getting the money ready for the autumn taxes, and the peasants come to me. Father, master, help us. Well, the peasants are all one's neighbors. One feels for them, so one advances them a third. But one says, remember, lads, I have helped you, and you must help me when I need it, whether it's the sowing of the oats, or the hay cutting, or the harvest. And well, one agrees so much for each taxpayer, though there are dishonest ones among them. To its true. Levin, who had long been familiar with these patriarchal methods, exchanged glances with Svabsky and interrupted Mikhail Petrovich, turning again to the gentleman with the gray whiskers. Then what do you think, he asked, what system is one to adopt nowadays? Why, manage like Mikhail Petrovich, or let the land for half the crop, or for rent to the peasants. That one can do. Only that's just how the general prosperity of the country is being ruined, where the land with serf labor and good management gave a yield of 9-to-1 on the half-crop system, it yields 3-to-1. Russia has been ruined by the emancipation. Sviavsky looked with smiling eyes at Levin and even made a faint gesture of irony to him. But Levin did not think the landowner's words absurd. He understood them better than he did Sviavsky a great deal more of what the gentleman with the gray whiskers said to show in what way Russia was ruined by the emancipation struck him indeed as very true, new to him, and quite incontestable. The landowner unmistakably spoke his own individual thought, a thing that very rarely happens, and a thought to which he had been brought not by a desire of finding some exercise for an idle brain, but a thought which had grown up out of the conditions of his life, which he had brooded over in the solitude of his village, and had considered in every aspect. The point is, don't you see that progress of every sort is only made by the use of authority, he said, evidently wishing to show he was not without culture. Take the reforms of Peter, of Catherine, of Alexander. Take European history and progress in agriculture more than anything else. The potato, for instance, that was introduced among us by force. The wooden plow, too, wasn't always used. It was introduced maybe in the days before the empire, but it was probably brought in by force. Now in our own day, we landowners in the serf times used various improvements in our husbandry, drying machines and threshing machines and carting manure and all the modern implements, all that we brought into use by our authority, and the peasants opposed it at first and ended by imitating us. Now, by the abolition of serfdom, we have been deprived of our authority, and so our husbandry, where it had been raised to a high level, is bound to sink to the most savage, primitive condition. That's how I see it. But why so? If it's rational, you'll be able to keep up the same system with hired labor, said Sviavsky. We have no power over them. With whom am I going to work the system? Allow me to ask. There it is, the labor force, the chief element in agriculture, thought Levin. With laborers, the laborers won't work well and won't work with good implements. Our laborer can do nothing but get drunk like a pig And when he's drunk, he ruins everything you give him. He makes the horses ill with too much water, cuts good harness, barters the tires of the wheels for drink, drops bits of iron into the threshing machine so as to break it. He loathes the sight of anything that's not after his fashion, and that's how it is. The whole level of husbandry has fallen. Lands gone out of cultivation, overgrown with weeds or divided among the peasants, and where millions of bushels were raised, you get 100,000. The wealth of the country has decreased if the same thing had been done, but with care that, and he proceeded to unfold his own scheme of emancipation, by means of which these drawbacks might have been avoided. This did not interest Levin, but when he had finished, Levin went back to his first position, and addressing Sviansky, and trying to draw him into expressing his serious opinion that the standard of culture is falling, and that with our present relations to the peasants, there's no possibility of farming on a rational system to yield a profit. That's perfectly true, said he. I don't believe it. Sviansky replied quite seriously. All I see is that we don't know how to cultivate the land, and that our system of agriculture in the serf days was by no means too high but too low. We have no machines, no good stock, no efficient supervision. We don't even know how to keep accounts. Ask any landowner, he won't be able to tell you what crop's profitable and what's not. Italian bookkeeping, said the gentleman of the gray whiskers ironically. You may keep your books as you like, but if they spoil everything for you, there won't be any profit. Why do they spoil things? A poor threshing machine or your Russian presser they will break, but my steam press they don't break. A wretched Russian nag they'll ruin, but keep good dray horses they won't ruin them. And so it's all round. We must raise our farming to a higher level. Oh, if only one had the means to do it. Nikolai Ivanovich, it's all very well for you, but for me with a son to keep at the university, lads to be educated at the high school, how am I going to buy these dray horses? Well, that's what the land banks are for, to get what's left me sold by auction. No thank you, I don't agree that it's necessary or possible to raise the level of agriculture still higher, said Levin. I devote myself to it, and I have means, but I can do nothing as to the banks. I don't know to whom they're any good for my part anyway. Whatever I've spent my money on in the way of husbandry, it has been a lost stock, a lost machinery, a loss. That's true enough. The gentleman with the gray whiskers chimed in, positively laughing with satisfaction. And I'm not the only one, pursued Levin. I mix with all the neighboring landowners who are cultivating their land on a rational system. They all, with rare exceptions, are doing so at a loss. Come tell us, how does your land do? Does it pay? Said Levin, and at once in Sviansky's eyes he detected that fleeting expression of alarm which he had noticed whenever he tried to penetrate beyond the outer chambers of Sviansky's mind. Moreover, this question on Levin's part was not quite in good faith. Madame Sviazhskaya had just told him that they had that summer invited a German expert in bookkeeping from Moscow who, for consideration of 500 rubles, had investigated the management of their property and found that it was costing them a loss of 3,000 odd rubles. She did not remember the precise sum, but it appeared that the German had worked it out to the fraction of a farthing. The gray-whiskered landowner smiled at the mention of the profits of Sviansky's farming, obviously aware how much gain his neighbor and marshal was likely to be making. Possibly it does not pay, answered Sviansky. That merely proves either that I'm a bad manager or that I've sunk my capital for the increase of my rents. Oh, rent, Levin cried with horror. Rent there may be in Europe where land has been improved by the labor put into it, but with us all the land is deteriorating from the labor put into it. In other words, they're working it out. So there's no question of rent. How no rent? It's a law. Then we are outside the law. Rent explains nothing for us, but simply muddles us. No, tell me, how can there be a theory of rent? Will you have some junket? Mache, pass us some junket or raspberries. He turned to his wife. Extraordinarily late. The raspberries are lasting this year, and in the happiest frame of mind, Sviansky got up and walked off, apparently supposing the conversation to have ended at the very point when to Levin it seemed that it was only just beginning. Having lost his antagonist, Levin continued the conversation with the gray-whiskered landowner, trying to prove to him that all the difficulty arises from the fact that we don't find out the peculiarities and habits of our laborer, but the landowner, like all Men who think independently and in isolation was slow in taking in any other person's idea, and particularly partial to his own. He stuck to it that the Russian peasant is a swine and likes swinishness, and that to get him out of his swinishness one must have authority, and there is none. One must have the stick, and we've become so liberal that we've all of a sudden replaced the stick that served us for 1,000 years by lawyers and model prisons where the worthless stinking peasant is fed on good soup and has a fixed allowance of cubic feet of air. What makes you think, said Levin, trying to get back to the question, that it's impossible to find some relation to the laborer in which the labor would become productive? That never could be so with the Russian peasantry. We've no power over them, answered the landowner. How can new conditions be found, said Sviazhensky, having eaten some junket and lighted a cigarette. Came back to the discussion. All possible relations to the labor force have been defined and studied. He said the relic of barbarism, the primitive commune, with each guarantee for all will disappear of itself, serfdom, has been abolished. There remains nothing but free labor, and its forms are fixed and ready-made and must be adopted permanent. Hands day laborers, rammers, you can't get out of those forms, but Europe is dissatisfied with these forms, dissatisfied and seeking new ones, and will find them in all probability. That's just what I was meaning, answered Levin. Why shouldn't we seek them for ourselves? Because it would be just like inventing afresh the means for constructing railways. They are already invented. But if they don't do for us, if they're stupid, asked Levin, and again he detected the expression of alarm in the eyes of Sviazhensky. Oh yes, we'll bury the world under our caps. We found the secret Europe was seeking for. I've heard all that, but excuse me, do you know all that's been done in Europe on the question of the organization of labor? No, very little. That question is now absorbing the best minds in Europe, the Schultz-Dillett movement, and then all this enormous literature of the labor question, the most liberal Lassalle movement, the Mulhausen experiment. That's a fact by now, as you're probably aware. I have some idea of it, but very vague. No, you only say that. No doubt you know all about it, as well as I do. I'm not a professor of sociology, of course, but it interested me, and really, if it interests you, you ought to study it. But what conclusion have they come to? Excuse me. The two neighbors had risen, and Sviazhensky, once more checking Levin in his inconvenient habit of peeping into what was beyond the outer chambers of his mind, went to see his guests out. Chapter 28. Levin was insufferably bored that evening with the ladies. He was stirred, as he had never been before, by the idea that the dissatisfaction he was feeling with his system of managing his land was not an exceptional case, but the general condition of things in Russia, that the organization of some relation of the laborers to the soil in which they would work, as with the peasant he had met halfway, to the Sviatskys, was not a dream, but a problem which must be solved, and it seemed to him that the problem could be solved, and that he ought to try and solve it. After saying good night to the ladies and promising to stay the whole of the next day so as to make an expedition on horseback with them to see an interesting ruin in the Crown Forest, Levin went before going to bed into his host's study to get the books on the labor question that Sviazhensky had offered him. Sviazhensky's study was a huge room surrounded by bookcases and with two tables in it, one a massive writing table standing in the middle of the room, and the other a round table covered with recent numbers of reviews and journals in different languages. Ranged like the rays of a star around the lamp on the writing table was a stand of drawers marked with gold lettering and full of papers of various sorts. Sviazhensky took out the books and sat down in a rocking chair. "What are you looking at there?" he said to Levin, who was standing at the round table looking through the reviews. "Oh yes, there's a very interesting article here," said Sviazhensky on the review Levin was holding in his hand. "It appears," he went on with eager interest, "that Friedrich was not after all the person chiefly responsible for the partition of Poland. It is proved, and with his characteristic clearness, he summed up those new, very important and interesting revelations. Although Levin was engrossed at the moment by his ideas about the problem of the land, he wondered as he heard Sviazhensky, what is there inside of him, and why is he interested in the partition of Poland? When Sviazhensky had finished, Levin could not help asking, well, and what? Then, and there was nothing to follow. It was simply interesting that it had been proved to be so, and so, but Sviazhensky did not explain, and saw no need to explain why it was interesting to him. Yes, but I was very much interested by your irritable neighbor, said Levin, sighing. He's a clever fellow, and said a lot that was true. Oh, get along with you, an inveterate supporter of serfdom at heart like all of them, said Sviashki. Whose marshal you are? Yes, only I marshal them in a other direction, said Sviavsky, laughing. I'll tell you what interests me very much, said Levin. He's right that our system, that's to say of rational farming, doesn't answer that. The only thing that answers is the money lender system, like that meek-looking gentleman's, or else the very simplest. Whose fault is it? Our own, of course. Besides, it's not true that it doesn't answer. It answers with Fossilkova factory. But I really don't know what it is. You are surprised at the people are at such a low stage of rational and moral development that it's obvious they're bound to oppose everything that's strange to them. In Europe, a rational system answers. Because the people are educated, it follows that we must educate the people, that's all. But how are we to educate the people? To educate the people, three things are needed: schools and schools and schools. But you said yourself, the people are at such a low stage of material development. What help are schools for? That do you know? You remind me of the story of the advice given to the sick man. You should try purgative medicine, taken worse. Try leeches, tried them worse. Well, then there's nothing left but to pray to God. Tried it worse. That's just how it is with us. I say political economy, you say worse. I say socialism worse, education worse. But how does schools help matters? They give the peasant fresh wants. Well, that's a thing I've never understood, Levin replied with heat. In what way are schools going to help the people to improve their material position? You say schools' education will give them fresh wants. So much the worse, since they won't be capable of satisfying them. And in what way a knowledge of addition and subtraction in the catechism is going to improve their material condition? I never could make out. The day before yesterday, I met a peasant woman in the evening with a little baby and asked her where she was going. She said she was going to the wise woman. Her boy had screaming fits, so she was taking him to be doctored. I asked why. How does the wise woman cure screaming fits? She puts the child on the hen roost and repeats some charm. Well, you're saying it yourself. What's wanted to prevent her taking her child to the hen roost to cure it of screaming fits is just, Sviatsky said, smiling good-humoredly. Oh no, said Levin with annoyance. The method of doctoring I merely meant as a simile for doctoring the people with. Schools, the people are poor and ignorant, that we see as surely as the peasant woman sees the baby is ill because it screams. But in what way this trouble of poverty and ignorance is to be cured by schools is as incomprehensible as how the hen roast affects the screaming. What has to be cured is what makes him poor. Well, and then at least you're in agreement with Spencer, whom you dislike so much. He says too that education may be the consequence of greater prosperity and comfort, of more frequent washing, as he says, but not of being able to read and write well. Then I'm very glad, or of the contrary very sorry, that I'm in agreement with Spencer. Only I've known it a long while. Schools can do no good. What will do good is an economic organization, which the people will become richer, will have more leisure. And then there will be schools still all over Europe. Now schools are obligatory. And how far do you agree with Spencer yourself about it? Asked Levin. But there was a gleam of alarm in Sviashki's eyes, and he said, smiling, no, that screaming story is positively capital. Did you really hear it yourself? Levin saw that he was not to discover the connection between this man's life and his thoughts. Obviously, he did not care in the least what his reasoning led him to. All he wanted was the process of reasoning, and he did not like it when the process of reasoning brought him into a blind alley. That was the only thing he disliked, and avoided by changing the conversation to something agreeable and amusing. All the impressions of the day, beginning with the impression made by the old peasant, which served as it were as the fundamental basis of all the conceptions and ideas of the day, threw Levin into violent excitement. This dear good Svobodsky, keeping a stock of ideas simply for social purposes, and obviously having some other principles hidden from Levin while out in the crowd, whose name is Legion, he guided public opinion by ideas. He did not share that irascible country gentleman, perfectly correct in the conclusions that he had been worried into by life, but wrong in his exasperation against a whole class and that the best class in Russia, his own dissatisfaction with the work he had been doing, and the vague hope of finding a remedy for all this was blended in a sense of inward turmoil and anticipation of some solution near at hand, left alone in the room assigned him. Lying on a spring mattress that yielded unexpectedly at every movement of his arm or his leg, Levin did not fall asleep for a long while. Not one conversation with Spivak, though he had said a great deal that was clever, had interested Levin. But the conclusions of the irascible landowner required consideration. Levin could not help recalling every word he had said and in imagination amending his own replies. Yes, I ought to have said to him, you say that our husbandry does not answer because the peasant hates improvements, and that they must be forced on him by authority. If no system of husbandry answered at all, without these improvements you would be quite right. But the only system that does answer is where laborer is working in accordance with his habits. Just as on the old peasant's land halfway here you're, and our general dissatisfaction with the system shows that either we are to blame or the laborers, we have gone our way the European way. Long while without asking ourselves about the qualities of our labor force, let us try to look upon the labor force not as an abstract force, but as the Russian peasant with his instincts, and we shall arrange our system of culture in accordance with that. Imagine, I ought to have said to him that you have the same system as the old peasant has, that you have found means of making your laborers take an interest in the success of the work, and have found the happy mean in the way of improvements which they will admit, and you will, without exhausting the soil, get twice or three times the yield you got before. Divided in halves, give half as the share of the labor, the surplus left you will be greater, and the share of labor will be greater too. And to do this, one must lower the standard of husbandry and interest the laborers in its success. How to do this, that's a matter of detail, but undoubtedly it can be done. This idea threw Levin into a great excitement. He did not sleep half the night thinking over in detail the putting of his idea into practice. He had not intended to go away next day, but he now determined to go home early in the morning. Besides, the sister-in-law with her low-necked bodice aroused in him a feeling akin to shame and remorse for some utterly base action. Most important of all, he must get back without delay. He would have to make haste to put his new project to the peasants before the sowing of the winter wheat, so that the sowing might be undertaken on a new basis. He made up his mind to revolutionize his whole system. Chapter 29. The carrying out of Levin's plan presented many difficulties, but he struggled on, doing his utmost, and attained a result which, though not what he desired, was enough to enable him, without self-deception, to believe that the attempt was worth the trouble. One of the chief difficulties was that the process of cultivating the land was in full swing, that it was impossible to stop everything and begin it all again from the beginning, and the machine had to be mended while in motion. When on the evening that he arrived home, he informed the bailiff of his plans. The latter, with visible pleasure, agreed with what he said, so long as he was pointing out that all that had been done up to that time was stupid and useless. The bailiff said that he had said so a long while ago, but no heed had been paid him. But as for the proposal made Levin to take a part as shareholder with his laborers in each agricultural undertaking, at this the bailiff simply expressed a profound despondency and offered no definite opinion, but began immediately talking of the urgent necessity of carrying the remaining sheaves of rye the next day, and of sending the men out for a second plowing, so that Levin felt that this was not the time for discussing it. On beginning to talk to the peasants about it, and making a proposition to cede them the land on new terms, he came into collision with the same great difficulty, that they were so much absorbed by the current work of the day that they had not time to consider the advantages and disadvantages of the proposed scheme. The simple-hearted Ivan the cowherd seemed completely to grasp Levin's proposal, that he should with his family take a share of the profits of the cattle yard, and he was in complete sympathy with the plan. But when Levin hinted at the future advantages, Ivan's face expressed alarm and regret that he could not hear all he had to say, and he made haste to find himself some task that would admit of no delay. He either snatched up the fork to pitch the hay out of the pens, or ran to get water or to clear out the dung. Another difficulty lay in the invincible disbelief of the peasant that a landowner's object could be anything else than a desire to squeeze all he could out of them. They were firmly convinced that his real aim, whatever he might say to them, would always be in what he did not say to them, and they themselves, in giving their opinions, said a great deal, but never said what was their real object. Moreover, Levin felt that the irascible landowner had been right. The peasants made their first and unalterable condition of any agreement whatever that they should not be forced to any new methods of tillage of any kind, nor to use new implements. They agreed that the modern plow plowed better, that the scarifier did the work more quickly, but they found thousands of reasons that made it out of the question for them to use either of them. And though he had accepted the conviction that he would have to lower the standard of cultivation, he felt sorry to give up improved methods, the advantages of which were so obvious. But in spite of all these difficulties, he got his way, and by autumn the system was working, or at least so it seemed to him. At first Levin had thought of giving up the whole farming of the land, just as it was to the peasants, the laborers, and the bailiff, on new conditions of partnership. But he was very soon convinced that this was impossible, and determined to divide it up. The cattle yard, the garden, hayfields, and arable land, divided into several parts, had to be made into separate lots. The simple-hearted cowherd Ivan, who Levin fancied understood the matter better than any of them, collecting together a gang of workers to help him, principally of his own family, became a partner in the cattle yard, a distant part of the estate. A tract of wasteland that had lay in fallow for 8 years was, with the help of the clever carpenter Fyodor Razumov, taken by 6 families of peasants on new conditions of partnership, and the peasant Shirayev took the management of all the vegetable gardens on the same terms. The remainder of the land was still worked on the old system, but these 3 associated partnerships were the first step to a new organization of the whole, and they completely took up Levin's time. It is true that in the cattle yard things went no better than before, and Ivan strenuously opposed warm housing for the cows and butter made of fresh cream, affirming that cows require less food if kept cold, and that butter is more profitable made from sour cream. And he asked for wages just as under the old system, and took not the slightest interest in the fact that the money he received was not wages, but an advance out of his future share in the profits. It is true that Fyodor Razumkov's company did not plow over the ground twice before sowing as had been agreed, justifying themselves on the plea that the time was too short. It is true that the peasants of the same company, though they had agreed to work the land on new conditions, always spoke of the land not as held in partnership, but as rented for half the crop, and more than once the peasants and Razumov himself said to Levin, if you would take a rent for the land, it would save you trouble, and we should be more free. Moreover, the same peasants kept putting off on various excuses the building of a cattle yard and barn on the land is agreed upon, and delayed doing it till the winter. It is true that Shrivov would have liked to let out the kitchen gardens he had undertaken in small lots to the peasants. He evidently quite misunderstood, and apparently intentionally misunderstood the conditions upon which the land had been given to him. Often to talking to the peasants and explaining to them all the advantages of the plan, Levin felt that the peasants heard nothing but the sound of his voice, and were firmly resolved, whatever he might say, not to let themselves be taken. And he felt this especially when he talked to the cleverest of peasants, Razumov, and detected the gleam in Razumov's eyes, which showed so plainly both ironical amusement at Levin and the firm conviction that if anyone were to be taken in, it would not be he, Razumov. But in spite of all this, Levin thought the system worked, and that by keeping accounts strictly and insisting on his own way, he would prove to them in the future the advantages of the arrangement, and then the system would go of itself. These matters, together with the management of the land still left on his hands, and the indoor work over his book, so engrossed Levin the whole summer that he scarcely ever went out shooting. At the end of August, he heard that the Oblonskys had gone away to Moscow from their servant, who brought back the side saddle. He felt that in not answering Darya Alexandrovna's letter, he had, by his rudeness of which he could not think without a flush of shame, burned his ships, and that he would never go and see them again. He had been just as rude with the Sviatskys, leaving them without saying goodbye, but he would never go to see them. Again, either he did not care about that now the business of reorganizing the farming of his land absorbed him as completely, as though there would never be anything else in his life. He read the books lent him by Sviatski and copying out what he had not got. He read both the economic and socialistic books on the subject, but as he had anticipated found nothing bearing on the scheme he had undertaken in the books on political economy and Mill, for instance, whom he studied first with great ardor, hoping every minute to find an answer to the questions that were engrossing him. He found laws deduced from the condition of land culture in Europe, but he did not see why these laws, which did not apply in Russia, must be general. He saw just the same thing in the socialistic books. Either they were the beautiful but impractical fantasies which had fascinated him when he was a student, or they were attempts at improving, rectifying the economic position in which Europe was placed, with which the system of land tenure in Russia had nothing in common. Political economy told him that the laws by which the wealth of Europe had been developed and was developing were universal and unvarying. Socialism told him that development along these lines leads to ruin, and neither of them gave an answer or even a hint in reply to the question what he, Levin, and all the Russian peasants and landowners were to do with their millions of hands and millions of acres to make them as productive as possible for the common weal. Having once taken the subject up, he read conscientiously everything bearing on it, and intended in the autumn to go abroad to study land systems on the spot, in order that he might not on this question be confronted with what so often met him on various subjects, often just as he was beginning to understand the idea in the mind of anyone he was talking to, and was beginning to explain his own. He would suddenly be told, but Kaufman, but Jones, but Dubois, but Macaulay. You haven't read them. They've thrashed that question out thoroughly. He saw now distinctly that Kaufman and Macaulay had nothing to tell him. He knew what he wanted. He saw that Russia has splendid land, splendid laborers, and that in certain cases, as at the peasants on the way to Svabsky's, the produce raised by the laborers in the land is great in the majority of cases. When capital is applied in the European way, the produce is small, and that this simply arises from the fact that the laborers want to work and work well only in their own peculiar way, and that this antagonism is not incidental but invariable and has its roots in the national spirit. He thought that the Russian people, whose task it was to colonize and cultivate vast tracts of unoccupied land, consciously adhered till all their land was occupied to the methods suitable to their purpose, and that their methods were by no means so bad as was generally supposed. And he wanted to prove this theoretically in his book and practically on his land. Chapter 30. At the end of September, the timber had been carted for building the cattle yard on the land that had been allotted to the Association of Peasants, and the butter from the cows was sold, and the profits divided. In practice, the system worked capitally, or at least so it seemed to Levin, in order to work out the whole subject theoretically, and to complete his book, which in Levin's daydreams was not merely to effect a revolution in political economy, but to annihilate that science entirely, and to lay the foundation of a new science of the relation of the people to the soil. All that was left to do was to make a tour abroad, and to study on the spot all that had been done in the same direction, and to collect conclusive evidence that all that had been done there was not what was wanted. Levin was only waiting for the delivery of his wheat to receive the money for it and go abroad. But the rains began preventing the harvesting of the corn and potatoes left in the fields, and putting a stop to all work, even to the delivery of the wheat. The mud was impassable along the roads. 2 mills were carried away, and the weather got worse and worse. On September 30th, the sun came out in the morning, and hoping for fine weather, Levin began making final preparations for his journey. He gave orders for the wheat to be delivered, sent the bailiff to the merchant to get the money owing him, and went out himself to give some final directions on the estate before setting off, having finished all his business, soaked through with the streams of water which kept running down the leather behind his neck and his gaiters. But in the keenest and most confident temper, Levin returned homewards in the evening. The weather had become worse than ever. Towards evening, the hail lashed the drenched Mari so cruelly that she went along sideways, shaking her head and ears. But Levin was all right under his hood, and he looked cheerfully about him at the muddy streams running under the wheels, at the drops hanging on every bare twig, at the whiteness of the patch of unmelted hailstones on the planks of the bridge, at the thick layer of still juicy fleshy leaves that lay heaped up about the stripped elm tree. In spite of the gloominess of nature around him, he felt peculiarly eager. The talks he had been having with the peasants in the further village had shown that they were beginning to get used to their new position. The old servant to whose hut he had gone to get dry evidently approved of Levin's plan, and of his own accord proposed to enter the partnership by the purchase of cattle. I have only to go stubbornly on towards my aim, and I shall attain my end, thought Levin, and it's something to work and take trouble for. This is not a matter of myself individually. The question of the public welfare comes into it. The whole system of culture, the chief element, and the condition of the people must be completely transformed. Instead of poverty, general prosperity and contentment; instead of hostility, harmony and unity of interests. In short, a bloodless revolution, but a revolution of the greatest magnitude, beginning in the little circle of our district, then the province, then Russia, the whole world, because a just idea cannot but be fruitful. Yes, it's an aim worth working for, and it's being me, Kostelevan, who went to a ball in a black tie and was refused by the Sherbatskaya girl, and who was intrinsically such a pitiful, worthless creature that proves nothing. I feel sure Franklin felt just as worthless, and he had no faith in himself, thinking of himself as a whole that means nothing, and he too most likely had an Agafia Mikhailovna to whom he confided his secrets. Musing on such thoughts, Levin reached home in the darkness. The bailiff, who had been to the merchant, had come back and brought part of the money for the wheat. An agreement had been made with the old servant, and on the road the bailiff had learned that everywhere the corn was still standing in the fields, so that his 160 shocks that had not been carried were nothing in comparison with the losses of others. After dinner, Levin was sitting as he usually did in an easy chair with a book, and as he read he went on thinking of the journey before him in connection with his book. Today all the significance of his book rose before him with special distinctness, and whole periods ranged themselves in his mind in illustration of his theories. I must write that down, he thought. That ought to form a brief introduction, which I thought unnecessary. Before he got up to go to his writing table, and Laska, lying at his feet, got up to stretching and looking at him as though to inquire where to go. But he had not time to write it down, for the head peasants had come round, and Levin went out into the hall to them after his levy. That is to say, giving directions about the labors of the next day, and seeing all the peasants who had business with him. Levin went back to his study and sat down to work. Laska lay under the table. Agrafia Mikhailovna settled herself in her place with her stocking. After writing for a little while, Levin suddenly thought with exceptional vividness of Kitty, her refusal in their last meeting. He got up and began walking about the room. What's the use of being dreary, said Agrafia Mikhailovna. Come, why do you stay on at home? You ought to go to some warm spring, especially now you're ready for the journey. Well, I am going away the day after tomorrow, Agrafia Mikhailovna. I must finish my work there. There, your work, you say, as if you hadn't done enough for the peasants. Why, as 'tis their saying, your master will be getting some honor from the Tsar for it, indeed. And it is a strange thing. Why need you worry about the peasants? I'm not worrying about them. I'm doing it for my own good. Agafia Mikhailovna knew every detail of Levin's plans for his land. Levin often put his views before her in all their complexity, and not uncommonly he argued with her and did not agree with her comments. But on this occasion she entirely misinterpreted what he had said of one's soul's salvation. We all know and must think before all else, she said with a sigh. Parfen Denisich, now for all he was no scholar, he died a death that God grant any one of us to like. She said, referring to a servant who had died recently, took the sacrament. And all that's not what I mean, said he. I mean that I'm acting for my own advantage. It's all the better for me if the peasants do their work better. Well, whatever you do, if he's a lazy good for not everything will be at 6s and 7s. If he has a conscience, he'll work, and If not, there's no doing anything. Oh, come, you say yourself. Ivan has begun looking after the cattle better. All I say is, answered Agrafia Mihailovna, evidently not speaking at random, but in strict sequence of idea, that you ought to get married. That's what I say. Agrafia Mihailovna's allusion to the very subject he had only just been thinking about hurt and stung him. Levin scowled, and without answering her, he sat down again to his work, repeating to himself all that he had been thinking of. The real significance of that work. Only at intervals he listened in the stillness to the click of Agafia Mihailovna's needles, and recollecting what he did not want to remember, he frowned again. At 9 o'clock they heard the bell and the faint vibration of a carriage over the mud. Well, here's visitors come to us, and you won't be dull, said Agrafia Mihailovna, getting up and going to the door. But Levin overtook her. His work was not going well now, and he was glad of a visitor, whoever it might be. Chapter 31. Running halfway down the staircase, Levin caught a sound he knew, a familiar cough in the hall, but he heard it indistinctly through the sound of his own footsteps, and hoped he was mistaken. Then he caught sight of a long, bony, familiar figure, and now it seemed there was no possibility of mistake, and yet he still went on hoping that this tall man, taking off his fur cloak and coughing, was not his brother Nikolai. Levin loved his brother, but being with him was always a torture. Just now, when Levin, under the influence of the thoughts that had come to him, and Agrafia Mikhailovna hint, was in a troubled and uncertain humor, the meeting with his brother that he had to face seemed particularly difficult. Instead of a lively, healthy visitor, some outsider, who would he hope to cheer him up in his uncertain humor, he had to see his brother, who knew him through and through, who would call forth all the thoughts nearest his heart, would force him to show himself fully, and that he was not disposed to do. Angry with himself for so base a feeling, Levin ran into the hall. As soon as he had seen his brother close, this feeling of selfish disappointment vanished instantly, and was replaced by pity, terrible as his brother Nikolai had been before. In his emaciation and sickliness now he looked still more emaciated, still more wasted. He was a skeleton covered with skin. He stood in the hall, jerking his long thin neck and pulling the scarf off it, and smiled a strange, pitiful smile. When he saw that smile, submissive and humble, Levin felt something clutching at his throat. You see, I've come to you, said Nikolai in a thick voice, never for 1 second taking his eyes off his brother's face. I've been meaning to a long while, but I've been unwell all the time. Now I'm ever so much better, he said, rubbing his beard with his big thin hands. Yes, yes, answered Levin, and he felt still more frightened when kissing him. He felt with his lips the dryness of his brother's skin, and saw close to him his big eyes full of a strange light. A few weeks before, Konstantin Levin had written to his brother that through the sale of the small part of the property that had remained undivided, there was a sum of about 2,000 rubles to come to him as his share. Nikolai said that he had come now to take this money, and what was more important, to stay a while in the old nest, to get in touch with the earth so as to renew his strength, like the heroes of old, for the work that lay before him. In spite of his exaggerated stoop and the emaciation that was so striking from his height, his movements were as rapid and abrupt as ever. Levin led him into his study. His brother dressed with particular care, a thing he never used to do, combed his scanty lank hair, and smiling went upstairs. He was in the most affectionate and good-humored mood, just as Levin often remembered him in childhood. He even referred to Sergei Ivanovich without rancor. When he saw Agafia Mihailovna, he made jokes with her and asked after the old servants. The news of the death of Parfen Dinish made a painful impression on him. A look of fear crossed his face, but he regained his serenity immediately. Of course, he was quite old, he said, and changed the subject. Well, I'll spend a month or two with you, and then I'm off to Moscow. Do you know me? Yakov has promised me a place there, and I'm going into the service. Now I'm going to arrange my life quite differently, he went on. You know, I got rid of that woman, Maria Nikolaevna. Why, what for? Oh, she was a horrid woman. She caused me all sorts of worries. But he did not say what the annoyances were. He could not say that he had cast off Maria Nikolaevna because the tea was weak, and above all, because she would look after him as though he were an invalid. Besides, I want to turn over a new leaf completely. Now I've done silly things, of course, like everybody else, but money's the last consideration. I don't regret it so long as there's health and my health, thank God, is quite restored." Levin listened and racked his brains, but could think of nothing to say. Nikolai probably felt the same. He began questioning his brother about his affairs, and Levin was glad to talk about himself, because then he could speak without hypocrisy. He told his brother of his plans and his doings. His brother listened, but evidently he was not interested by it. These two men were so akin, so near each other, that the slightest gesture, the tone of voice, told both more than could be said in words. Both of them now had only one thought: the illness of Nikolai and the nearness of his death, which stifled all else, but neither of them dared to speak of it, and so whatever they said, not uttering the one thought that filled their minds, was all falsehood. Never had Levin been so glad. When the evening was over, and it was time to go to bed, never with any outside person, never on any official visit, had he been so unnatural and false as he was that evening, and the consciousness of his unnaturalness and the remorse he felt at it made him even more unnatural. He wanted to weep over his dying, dearly loved brother, and he had to listen and keep on talking of how he meant to live, as the house was damp and only one bedroom had been kept heated. Levin put his brother to sleep in his own bedroom. Behind a screen, his brother got into bed, and whether he slept or did not sleep, tossed about like a sick man, coughed, and when he could not get his throat clear, mumbled something. Sometimes, when his breathing was painful, he said, "Oh my God." Sometimes, when he was choking, he muttered angrily, "Ah, the devil." Levin could not sleep for a long while hearing him. His thoughts were of the most various, but the end of all his thoughts was the same: death. Death, the inevitable end of all, for the first time presented itself to him with irresistible force, and death, which was here in his beloved brother, groaning half asleep, and from habit calling without distinction on God, and the devil was not so remote as it had hitherto seemed to him. It was in himself too. He felt that if not today, tomorrow. If not tomorrow, in 30 years, wasn't it all the same? And what was this inevitable death? He did not know, and had never thought about it, and what was more, had not the power, had not the courage to think about it. I want to do something, but I had forgotten it must all end. I had forgotten death. He sat on his bed in the darkness, crouched up, hugging his knees and holding his breath from the strain of thought. He pondered, but the more intensely he thought, the clearer it became to him that it was indubitably so, that in reality, looking upon life, he had forgotten one little fact: that death will come and all ends. That nothing was even worth beginning, and that there was no helping it anyway. Yes, it was awful, but it was so. But I am alive still now. What's to be done? What's to be done? He said in despair. He lighted a candle, got up cautiously, and went to the looking glass, and began looking at his face and hair. Yes, there were gray hairs about his temples. He opened his mouth. His back teeth were beginning to decay. He bared his muscular arms. Yes, there was strength in them. But Nikolai, who lay there breathing with what was left of lungs, had had a strong, healthy body too. And suddenly he recalled how they used to go to bed together as children, and how they only waited till Fyodor Bogdanich was out of the room to fling pillows at each other and laugh irrepressibly, so that even their awe of Fyodor Bogdanich could not check the effervescing, overbrimming sense of life and happiness. And now that bent, hollow chest, and I not knowing what will become of me, or wherefore, ah, damnation, why do you keep fidgeting? Why don't you go to sleep? His brother's voice called to him. Oh, I don't know, I'm not sleepy. I've had a good sleep. I'm not in a sweat now. Just feel my shirt. It's not wet, is it? Levin withdrew behind the screen and put out the candle, but for a long while he could not sleep. The question, how to live, had hardly begun to grow a little clearer to him, when a new insoluble question presented itself: death. Why, he's dying. Yes, he'll die in the spring, and how help him? What can I say to him? What do I know about it? I'd even forgotten that it was at all. Chapter 32. Levin had long before made the observation that when one is uncomfortable with people, from their being excessively amenable and meek, one is apt very soon after to find things intolerable from their touchiness and irritability. He felt that this was how it would be with his brother, and his brother Nikolai's gentleness did in fact not last out for long. The very next morning he began to be irritable, and seemed doing his best to find fault with his brother, attacking him on his tenderest points. Levin felt himself to blame, and could not set things right. He felt that if they had both not kept up appearances, but had spoken as it is called from the heart, that is to say, had said only just what they were thinking and feeling. They would simply have looked into each other's faces, and Constantine could only have said, "You're dying," and Nikolai could only have answered, "I know I'm dying, but I'm afraid. And they could have said nothing more if they had said only what was in their hearts. But life like that was impossible, and so Constantine tried to do what he had been trying to do all his life and never could learn to do, though as far as he could observe many people knew so well how to do it, and without it there was no living at all. He tried to say what he was not thinking, but he felt continually that it had a ring of falsehood, that his brother detected him in it, and was exasperated at it. The third day, Nikolai induced his brother to explain his plan to him again, and began not merely attacking it but intentionally confounding it with communism. You've simply borrowed an idea that's not your own, but you've distorted it, and are trying to apply it where it's not applicable. But I tell you, it's nothing to do with it. They deny the justice of property, of capital, of inheritance. While I do not deny this chief stimulus, Levin felt disgusted himself at using such expressions, but ever since he'd been engrossed by his work, he had unconsciously come more and more frequently to use words not Russian. All I want is to regulate labor, which means you've borrowed an idea, stripped it of all that gave it its force, and want to make believe that it's something new, said Nikolai, angrily tugging at his necktie. But my idea has nothing in common. That anyway, said Nikolai. Levin, with an ironical smile, his eyes flashing malignantly, has the charm of what's one to call it geometrical symmetry, of clearness, of definiteness. It may be a utopia, but if once one allows the possibility of making of all the past a tabula rasa, no property, no family, then labor would organize itself. But you gain nothing. Why do you mix things up? I've never been a communist, but I have, and I consider it's premature, but rational, and it has a future, just like Christianity in its first stages. All that I maintain is that the labor force ought to be investigated from the point of view of natural science, that is to say, it ought to be studied, its qualities ascertained. But that's utter waste of time. That force finds a certain form of activity of itself according to the stage of its development. There have been slaves first everywhere, then métayers, and we have the half-crop system, rent and day laborers. What are you trying to find? Levin suddenly lost his temper at these words, because at the bottom of his heart he was afraid that it was true, that he was trying to hold the balance even between communism and the familiar forms, and that this was hardly possible. I am trying to find means of working productively for myself and for the laborers. I want to organize, he said hotly. You don't want to organize anything. It's simply just as you've been all your life, that you want to be original, to pose as not exploiting the peasant simply, but with some idea in view. Oh, all right, that's what you think, and let me alone, answered Levin, feeling the muscles of his left cheek twitching uncontrollably. You've never had and never have convictions. All you want is to please your vanity. Oh, very well, then let me alone, and I will let you alone, and it's high time I did, and go to the devil with you, and I'm very sorry I ever came, in spite of all Levin's efforts to soothe his brother. Afterwards, Nikolai would listen to nothing he said, declaring that it was better to part, and Constantine saw that it simply was, that life was unbearable to him. Nikolai was just getting ready to go when Constantine went into him again and begged him rather unnaturally to forgive him if he'd hurt his feelings in any way. Ah, generosity, said Nikolai, and he smiled. If you want to be right, I can give you that satisfaction. You're in the right, but I'm going all the same. It was only just at parting that Nikolai kissed him and said, looking with sudden strangeness and seriousness at his brother, anyway, don't remember evil against me, Kostya. And his voice quivered. These were the only words that had been spoken sincerely between them. Levin knew that those words meant, you see, and you know that I'm in a bad way, and maybe we shall not see each other again. Levin knew this, and the tears gushed from his eyes. He kissed his brother once more, but he could not speak and knew not what to say. 3 days after his brother's departure, Levin set off for his foreign tour, happening to meet Sharapov, Kitty's cousin, in the railway train. Levin greatly astonished him by his depression. What's the matter with you? Sharapov asked him. Oh, nothing. There's not much happiness in life, not much. You'd come with me to Paris instead of Mulhouse, and you shall see how to be happy. No, I've done with it all. It's time I was "Dead, well, that's a good one," said Sherbovsky, laughing. "Why, I'm only just getting ready to begin." "Yes, I thought the same not long ago. But now I know I shall soon be dead." Levin said what he had genuinely been thinking of late. He saw nothing but death, or the advance towards death, in everything. But his cherished scheme only engrossed him the more. Life had to be got through somehow till death did come. Darkness had fallen upon everything for him, and just because of this darkness, he felt that the one guiding clue in the darkness was his work, and he clutched it and clung to it with all of his strength. Part for Chapter 1. The Karenins, husband and wife, continued living in the same house, met every day, but were complete strangers to one another. Alexei Alexandrovich made it a rule to see his wife every day, so that the servants might have no grounds for suppositions, but avoided dining at home. Vronsky was never at Alexei Alexandrovich's house, but Anna saw him away from home, and her husband was aware of it. The position was one of misery for all three, and not one of them would have been equal to enduring this position for a single day, if it had not been for the expectation that it would change, that it was merely a temporary painful ordeal which would pass over. Alexei Alexandrovich hoped that this passion would pass as everything does pass, that everyone would forget about it, and his name would remain unsullied. Anna, on whom the position depended, and for whom it was more miserable than for anyone, endured it, because she not merely hoped, but firmly believed that it would all very soon be settled and come right. She had not the least idea what would settle the position, but she firmly believed that something would very soon turn up. Now Francie, against his own will or wishes, followed her lead, hoped too that something apart from his own action would be sure to solve all difficulties. In the middle of winter, Vronsky spent a very tiresome week. A foreign prince who had come to a visit to Petersburg was put under his charge, and he had to show him the sights worth seeing. Vronsky was of distinguished appearance. He possessed moreover the art of behaving with respectful dignity, and was used to having to do with such grand personages. That was how he came to be put in charge of the prince, but he felt his duties very irksome. The prince was anxious to miss nothing of which he would be asked at home, had he seen that in Russia, and on his own account he was anxious to enjoy to the utmost all Russian forms of amusement. Vronsky was obliged to be his guide in satisfying both these inclinations. The mornings they spent driving to look at places of interest, the evenings they passed enjoying the national entertainments. The prince rejoiced in health exceptional even among princes by gymnastics and careful attention to his health. He had brought himself to such a point that in spite of his excess and pleasure he looked as fresh as a big glossy green Dutch cucumber. The prince had traveled a great deal, and considered one of the chief advantages of modern facilities of communication was the accessibility of the pleasures of all nations. He had been in Spain, and there had indulged in serenades, and had made friends with a Spanish girl who played the mandolin. In Switzerland he had killed chamois. In England he had galloped in a red coat over hedges and killed 100 pheasants for a bet. In Turkey he had got into a harem. In India he had hunted on an elephant, and now in Russia he wished to taste all the specially Russian forms of pleasure. Vronsky, who was as it were chief master of the ceremonies, to him was at great pains to arrange all the Russian amusements suggested by various persons. To the prince they had race horses and Russian pancakes and bear hunts and 3-horse sledges and gypsies and drinking feasts, with the Russian accompaniment of broken crockery, and the prince with surprising ease fell in with the Russian spirit. Smashed trays full of crockery, sat with a gypsy girl on his knee, and seemed to be asking what more, and does the whole Russian spirit consist in just this? In reality, of all the Russian entertainments, the prince liked best French actresses and ballet dancers and white seal champagne. Vronsky was used to princes, but either because he had himself changed of late, or that he was into close proximity to the prince, that week seemed fearfully wearisome to him. The whole of that week he experienced a sensation such as a man might have set in charge of a dangerous madman, afraid of the madman, and at the same time from being with him, fearing for his own reason. Vronsky was continually conscious of the necessity of never for a second relaxing the tone of stern official respectfulness, that he might not himself be insulted. The prince's manner of treating the very people who, to Vronsky's surprise, were ready to descend to any depths to provide him with Russian amusements was contemptuous. His criticisms of Russian women whom he wished to study more than once made Vronsky crimson with indignation. The chief reason why the prince was so particularly disagreeable to Vronsky was that he could not help seeing himself in him, and what he saw in this mirror did not gratify his self-esteem. He was a very stupid and very self-satisfied and very healthy and very well-washed man, and nothing else. He was a gentleman. That was true, and Vronsky could not deny it. He was equable and not cringing with his superiors, was free and ingratiating in his behavior with his equals, and was contemptuously indulgent with his inferiors. Vronsky was himself the same and regarded it as a great merit to be so. But for this prince, he was an inferior, and his contemptuous and indulgent attitude to him revolted him. Brainless beef can I be like that, he thought. Be that as it might, when on the 7th day he parted from the prince, who was starting for Moscow, and received his thanks, he was happy to be rid of his uncomfortable position and the unpleasant reflection of himself. He said goodbye to him at the station on their return from a bear hunt, at which they had had a display of Russian prowess kept up all night. When he got home, Vronsky found there was a note from Anna. She wrote, "I am ill and unhappy. I cannot come out, but I cannot go on longer without seeing you. Come in this evening. Alexei Alexandrovich goes to the council at 7 and will be there till 10. Thinking for an instant of the strangeness of her bidding him come straight to her in spite of her husband's insisting on her not receiving him, he decided to go. Vronsky had that winter got his promotion, was now a colonel, had left the regimental quarters, and was living alone. After having some lunch, he lay down on the sofa immediately, and in 5 minutes memories of the hideous scenes he had witnessed during the last few days were confused together and joined on to a mental image of Anna and of the peasant who had played an important part in the bear hunt. And Vronsky fell asleep. He waked up in the dark, trembling with horror, and made haste to light a candle. What was it? What was the dreadful thing I dreamed? Yes, I think a little dirty man with a disheveled beard was stooping down doing something, and all of a sudden he began saying some strange words in French. Yes, there was nothing else in the dream, he said to himself. But why was it so awful? He vividly recalled the peasant again, and those incomprehensible French words the peasant had uttered, and a chill of horror ran down his spine. What nonsense, thought Vronsky, and glanced at his watch. It was 8:30 already. He rang up his servant, dressed in haste, and went out onto the steps, completely forgetting the dream and only worried at being late. As he drove up to the Karen's entrance, he looked at his watch and saw it was 10 minutes to 9. A high narrow carriage with a pair of greys was standing at the entrance. He recognized Anna's carriage. She's coming to me, thought Vronsky, and better she should. I don't like going into that house, but no matter, I can't hide myself, he thought, and with that manner peculiar to him from childhood, as of a man who has nothing to be ashamed of. Vronsky got out of his sledge and went to the door. The door opened, and the hall porter with a rug on his arm called the carriage. Vronsky, though he did not usually notice details, noticed at this moment the amazed expression with which the porter glanced at him in the very doorway. Vronsky almost ran up against Alexei Alexandrovich. The gas jet threw its full light on the bloodless sunken face under the black hat, and on the white cravat brilliant against the beaver of the coat. Koronine's fixed dull eyes were fastened upon Vronsky's face. Vronsky bowed, and Alexei Alexandrovich, chewing his lips, lifted his hand to his hat and went on. Vronsky saw him, without looking round, get into the carriage, pick up the rug and the opera glass at the window, and disappear. Vronsky went into the hall. His brows were scowling, and his eyes gleamed with a proud and angry light in them. What a position, he thought. If he would fight, would stand up for his honor, I could express my feelings, but this weakness or baseness, he puts me in the position of playing false, which I never meant and never mean to do. Vronsky's ideas had changed since the day of his conversation with Anna in the Veda garden, unconsciously yielding to the weakness of Anna, who had surrendered herself up to him utterly and simply looked to him to decide her fate, ready to submit to anything. He had long ceased to think that their time might end as he had thought. Then his ambitious plans had retreated into the background again, and feeling that he had got out of that circle of activity in which everything was definite, he had given himself entirely to his passion, and that passion was binding him more and more closely to her. He was still in the hall When he caught the sound of her retreating footsteps, he knew she had been expecting him, had listened for him, and was now going back to the drawing room. No, she cried on seeing him, and at the first sound of her voice, the tears came into her eyes. No, if things are to go on like this, the end will come much, much too soon. What is it, dear one? What, I've been waiting in agony for an hour, 2 hours. No, I won't. I can't quarrel with you. Of course you couldn't come. No, I won't. She laid her two hands on his shoulders and looked a long while at him with a profound, passionate, and at the same time searching look. She was studying his face to make up for the time she had not seen him. She was, every time she saw him, making the picture of him in her imagination incomparably superior, impossible in reality, fit with him as he really was. Chapter 3. You met him, she asked, when they had sat down at the table in the lamplight. You're punished, you see, for being late. Yes, but how was it? Wasn't he to be at the council? He'd been, and come back, and was going out somewhere again. But that's no matter, don't talk about it. Where have you been with the prince still? She knew every detail of his existence. He was going to say that he'd been up all night and had dropped asleep, but looking at her thrilled and rapturous face, he was ashamed, and he said he had had to go to report on the prince's departure. But it's over now. He's gone. Thank God it's over. You wouldn't believe how insufferable it's been for me. Why so? Isn't it the life all of you, all young men, always lead? She said, knitting her brows and taking up the crochet work that was lying on the table and began drawing the hook out of it without looking at Vronsky. I gave that life up long ago, said he, wondering at the change in her face and trying to divine its meaning. And I confess, he said with a smile showing his thick white teeth, this week I've been, as it were, looking at myself in a glass, seeing that life, and I didn't like it. She held the work in her hands, but did not crochet, and looked at him with strange, shining, and hostile eyes. This morning Lisa came to see me. They're not afraid to call on me, in spite of the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, she put in, and she told me about your Athenian evening, how loathsome. I was just going to say, she interrupted him, it was that truss you used to know. I was just saying how disgusting you are, you men. How is it you can't understand that a woman can never forget? That she said, getting more and more angry, and so letting him see the cause of her irritation, especially a woman who cannot know your life. What do I know? What have I ever known? She said, what you tell me. And how do I know whether you tell me the truth? Anna, you're hurting me. Don't you trust me? Haven't I told you that I haven't a thought I wouldn't lay bare to you? Yes, yes, she said, evidently trying to suppress her jealous thoughts. But if only you knew how wretched I am. I believe you, I believe you. What were you saying? But he could not at once recall what he had been going to say. These fits of jealousy, which of late had been more and more frequent with her, horrified him, and however much he tried to disguise the fact, made him feel cold to her. Although he knew the cause of her jealousy was her love for him, how often he had told himself that her love was happiness, and now she loved him as a woman can love when love has outweighed for her all the good things of life. And he was much further from happiness than when he had followed her from Moscow, than he had thought himself unhappy. But happiness was before him. Now he felt that the best happiness was already left behind. She was utterly unlike what she had been when he first saw her. Both morally and physically she had changed for the worse. She had broadened out all over and in her face. At the time when she was speaking of the actress, there was an evil expression of hatred that distorted it. He looked at her as a man looks at a faded flower he has gathered with difficulty, recognizing in it the beauty for which he picked and ruined it. And in spite of this, he felt that then, when his love was stronger, he could, if he had greatly wished it, have torn that love out of his heart. But now, when as at that moment it seemed to him he felt no love for her, he knew that what bound him to her could not be broken. Well, what was it you were going to say about the prince? I have driven away the fiend, she added. The fiend was the name they had given her jealousy. What did you begin to tell me about the prince? Why did you find it so tiresome? What was intolerable? He said, trying to pick up the thread of his interrupted thought. He does not improve on closer acquaintance. If you want him to find here, he is a prime, well-fed beast, such as takes medals at the cattle shows, and nothing more, he said with a tone of vexation that interested her. No, how so? She replied, he's seen a great deal. Anyway, he's cultured. It's an utterly different culture, their culture he's cultivated. One sees simply to be able to despise culture as they despise everything but animal pleasures. But don't you all care for these animal pleasures, she said, and again he noticed a dark look in her eyes that avoided him. How is it you're defending him? He said, smiling. I'm not defending him. It's nothing to me. But I imagine if you had not cared for those pleasures yourself, you might have got out of them. But it affords you satisfaction to gaze at Teresa in the attire of Eve again. The devil again, Vronsky said, taking the hand she had laid on the table and kissing it. Yes, but I can't help it. You don't know what I have suffered waiting for you. I believe I'm not jealous. I'm not jealous. I believe you when you're here, but when you're away somewhere leading your life so incomprehensible to me. She turned away from him, pulled the hook at last out of the crochet work, and rapidly, with the help of her forefinger, began working loop after loop of the wool that was dazzling white in the lamplight, while the slender wrist moved swiftly, nervously in the embroidered cuff. How was it then? Where did you meet Alexei Alexandrovich? Her voice sounded in an unnatural and jarring tone. We ran up against each other in the doorway, and he bowed to you like this. She drew a long face, and half closing her eyes, quickly transformed her expression, folded her hands, and Vronsky suddenly saw in her beautiful face the very expression with which Alexei Alexandrovich had bowed to him. He smiled while she laughed gaily, with that sweet, deep laugh, which was one of her greatest charms. I don't understand him in the least, said Vronsky. If after your avowal to him at your country house he'd broken with you, if he'd called me out. But this I can't understand. How can he put up with such a position? He feels it, that's evident. She said sneeringly. He's perfectly satisfied. What are we all miserable for when everything might be so happy? Only not he. Don't I know him, the falsity in which he's utterly steeped? Could one with any feeling live as he's living with me? He understands nothing and feels nothing. Could a man of any feeling live in the same house with his unfaithful wife? Could he talk to her, call her my dear? And again she could not help mimicking him. Anna must share on a dear. He's not a man, not a human being. He's a doll. No one knows him. But I know him. Oh, if I'd been in his place I'd long ago have killed, have torn to pieces a wife like me. I wouldn't have said Anna must share. He's not a man, he's an official machine. He doesn't understand that I'm your wife, that he's outside, that he's superfluous. Don't let's talk of him. You're unfair, very unfair, dearest, said Vronsky, trying to soothe her. But never mind, don't let's talk of him. Tell me what you've been doing. What is the matter? What has been wrong with you? And what did the doctor say? She looked at him with mocking amusement. Evidently she had hit on other absurd and grotesque aspects in her husband, and was awaiting the moment to give expression to them. But he went on, I imagine that it's not illness, but your condition. When will it be? The ironical light died away in her eyes, but a different smile, a consciousness of something he did not know what, and of quiet melancholy came over her face. Soon you say that our position is miserable, that we must put an end to it. If you knew how terrible it is to me, what I would give to be able to love you freely and boldly. I should not torture myself and torture you with my jealousy, and it will come soon, but not as we expect. And at the thought of how it would come, she seemed so pitiful to herself that tears came into her eyes, and she could not go on. She laid her hand on his sleeve, dazzling and white with its rings in the lamplight. It won't come as we suppose. I didn't mean to say this to you, but you've made me. Soon all will be over, and we shall all be at peace and suffer no more. I don't understand, he said, understanding her. You asked when soon, and I shan't live through it. Don't interrupt me. And she made haste to speak. I know it. I know for certain I shall die, and I'm very glad I shall die and release myself. And you. Tears dropped from her eyes. He bent down over her hand and began kissing it, trying to hide his emotion, which he knew had no sort of grounds, though he could not control it. Yes, it's better so, she said, tightly gripping his hand. That's the only way left us. He had recovered himself and lifted his head. How absurd, what absurd nonsense you're talking. No, it's the truth. What's the truth? That I shall die. I have had a dream, repeated Vronsky, and instantly he recalled the peasant of his dream. Yes, a dream, she said. It's a long while since I dreamed it. I dreamed that I ran into my bedroom. Then I had to get something there to find out. Something. You know how it is in dreams, she said, her eyes wide with horror. And in the bedroom in the corner stood something. Oh, what nonsense. How can you believe but she would not let him interrupt her. What she was saying was too important to her, and the something turned round, and I saw it was a peasant with a disheveled beard, little and dreadful looking. I wanted to run away, but he bent down over a sack and was fumbling there with his hands. She showed how he had moved his hands. There was terror in her face, and Vronsky, remembering his dream, felt the same terror filling his soul. He was fumbling and kept talking quickly in French. You know, il faut le battre, le faire libre la patrie. And in my horror I tried to wake up and woke up, but woke up in the dream, and I began asking myself what it meant. And Corny said to me in childbirth, "You'll die, ma'am, you'll die." And I woke up. What nonsense, said Vronsky, but he felt himself that there was no conviction in his voice. "But don't let's talk of it. Ring the bell, I'll have tea and stay a little now. It's not long I shall." But all at once she stopped. The expression of her face instantaneously changed. Horror and excitement were suddenly replaced by a soft, solemn, blissful attention. He could not comprehend the meaning of the change. She was listening to the stirring of the new life within her. Chapter 4. Alexei Alexandrovich, after meeting Vronsky on his own steps, drove as he had intended to the Italian opera. He sat through 2 acts there and saw everyone he had wanted to see. On returning home, he carefully scrutinized the hat stand, and noticing that there was not a military overcoat there, he went as usual to his own room. But contrary to his usual habit, he did not go to bed. He walked up and down his study till 3 o'clock in the morning. The feeling of furious anger with his wife, who would not observe the proprieties and keep to the one stipulation he had laid on her, not to receive her lover in her own home, gave him no peace. She had not complied with his request, and he was bound to punish her and carry out his threat, obtain a divorce, and take away his son. He knew all the difficulties connected with this course, but he had said he would do it, and now he must carry out his threat. Countess Lydia Ivanovna had hinted that this was the best way out of his position, and of late the obtaining of divorces had been brought to such perfection that Alexei Alexandrovich saw a possibility of overcoming the formal difficulties.